up, my fellow challenge lovers? Welcome to the Challenge Historian, where we dive deep into all things the challenge, past, present, or future. If it's happening in the challenge universe, then we are here to document it. I am your host and dedicated challenge historian, Jacob Hollaball. Thank you so very, very much for being here with me today. On today's podcast, the Rewatch series continues. However, slight change, first of its kind change for the first time in the history of this Rewatch series, which is now done 16 seasons deep. We are going out of order for the first time ever, and hopefully one of maybe even the only time ever. Today's podcast is all about Fresh Meat 2, one of my absolute favorite seasons of all time, a great, great season to talk about, and I had a great guest on to talk about it with me, the wonderful Mike Lewis from the Mike Lewis podcast. If you're not following, if you're not listening to his interviews of Challenge cast members, others from the MTV world, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Go follow Mike. But here's the thing, a little behind the curtain. The reason we're going out of order is not because of any, we're skipping the Duel 2 or that we're skipping the Ruins. God forbid we skip the Duel 2, let alone the Ruins. We're not going to skip either one. We're doing both of them. We meant to be doing one of those, the Duel 2, today. However, things got a little backlogged here at the Challenge Historian. We were running a little behind, and we already had our interview scheduled with Mike. I had done the rewatch of that season a little bit in advance, so we were ready to go. We recorded, and then some things came up over the weekend, and instead of finishing the Duel 2 podcast, I realized I already had one in the can there, waiting, ready to go. So why not just skip ahead, make things a little bit easier, make things fit in the schedule a little bit better, and most of all, make sure that we had a rewatch podcast coming out today on this Monday. We kept to the schedule. We're trying to get through as many of these seasons by the end of the year as we can. We couldn't skip another week, God forbid, and I really didn't want to stay up all night super duper sick, if I'm being honest. So we're bringing Fresh Meat 2 today. Myself, Mike Lewis, breaking it all down. It was a wonderful time. It's a great podcast. You're going to love it. And then we will be back next week to hit the Duel 2 the week after that with the Ruins, and then on to Cutthroat and back in order for the foreseeable future there. I don't plan on going out of order again, but for this one, it worked out that that's just how it was best going to be, and that's how it is. So that's what you got today. Fresh Meat 2, me and Mike. Other programming notes. Remember, if you're a Survivor watcher, I'm covering Survivor over on Most Likely 2 podcast feed with Paige. Those are coming out Saturday mornings. Later this week, we've got our season 38 full season preview podcast coming out on Wednesday, and Challenge documentary recap coming out on Friday. So you still got the 3 pods this week, just a different rewatch series than we originally planned. But if you've been waiting on the Duel 2, if you've done your Duel 2 rewatch, hats off to you. Well done. I apologize if you haven't done the Fresh Meat one, but you'll be all right. We'll hit the Duel 2 next week, and then you can do your Fresh Meat 2 rewatch after you've listened to this wonderful podcast. Or if you need to, you can put this away for now. Just make sure you come back when you've done your rewatch and you are ready to break it all down with myself and Mike, which I am right now. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here is myself, Mike Lewis, breaking down one of the all-time great seasons, Fresh Meat 2. All right, Challenge lovers, because we are discussing such an amazing season of the Challenge today, Fresh Meat 2, one of my all-time favorites, I knew I had to find an amazing guest co-host to match the occasion, and I have done just that. There's a very good chance you already know of this man and love listening to this man from his incredible interviews on his own podcast, and if you don't, you need to get to work. You've got a lot of great content in your future. From the Mike Lewis podcast, we've got Mike Lewis himself with us today. Mike, thank you for joining us. How are you doing, my friend?
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I've seen a lot of your stuff through the grapevine. I think you do a very good job. And the whole concept of your podcast is really cool. And I think it's something unique. And I'm glad that you're doing it. And I'm glad to be a part of it. And there's no better season to talk to you about.
I appreciate that. And yes, you did. You picked very well, my friend, because as I've started to try to reach out to other experts in the Challenge world here about seasons, trying to get some co-hosts lined up, I've been very obviously just want to have wonderful folks like yourself join me, but I've also been very curious because it's my way of asking people like yourself also of like, hey, I'd love to have you come on. I'm at this season. So, any of these next 5, 6 seasons, something of interest to you, and to have people jump at like you did of like, definitely this one, like, oh, okay, good. That tells me something about you. You've got good taste. You picked correctly. Before we dive into Fresh Meat 2, just to give, the listeners a little bit background if they haven't been listening to all your wonderful interviews and everything on the Mike Lewis podcast, which again, if you're not, I don't know why you're not. I'm sure you're at least aware of it if you're aware of anything in the challenge world. But for those who may need a little extra background, can you give us the kind of cliff notes of where your challenge or MTV fandom came from, and kind of when you decided to take that and start a podcast with it, and how that's all going for you?
Yeah, so just the basis here, I think the very first footage or clips that I've ever seen of the challenge was the Duel 2, and I probably was about 7 years old at the time. I think it was Brad versus MJ's elimination on the Duel 2, Dual Pole Dancing, I believe it was called. We had to
Mm-hmm.
climb that little pole thing and kind of ring that bell. That was the first thing that I ever watched of the challenge. I was like, wow, like this is interesting. Like this is something new. And so I watched the end of Duel 2, obviously, and I was furious with how Landon how Landon's season unfolded, seeing as how like that was the season. I think we could probably agree that was probably his best all-around season. Ironically, it's the one that he didn't win. So
Mm-hmm.
that kind of had me like so mad. And then so that was like my first incarnation into the challenge, and then from there on, obviously, I watched all the full seasons from there forth. So yeah, about 2 years ago when COVID first started, obviously, as you guys know, not a whole lot was going on in the world the first few months that we were into it. And so I was looking for something to do, and I decided, I just wanted to start a channel. Wasn't quite sure if the podcast was even like in my radar, but that's just kind of what it fell on. And the challenge was obviously something I was interested in, and I was analyzing from a standpoint of like sort of a sport, but sort of like a show at the same time. Like they were kind of intertwined with each other because I am a big sports fan, but I'm also like a big just TV fan too. And I decided, maybe just give it a stab at it, and started interviewing people. And I became interested in hearing like some of the thoughts behind like their actions on the shows, or like stuff we didn't even see on the show. So I just kept doing that. And I quickly noticed that there was an audience for it that I wasn't even aware of when I got started. And so I just became passionate about putting out content for other people to see. Like that was just something that I never anticipated, like people coming to my space to see or hear insight from me talking to other people is just something that's really cool. And I think that's one of the rare and beautiful arts that we have to offer today with social media.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I got a little bit of an inkling from, one of the folks that you mentioned during that, but who would you say, to give us a little bit knowledge of your kind of challenge taste, before we get into kind of help us shape where some of your opinions about this season we're going to talk about come from? Who are some of your favorite and least favorite cast members ever, and maybe a season or two that are favorite or least favorite ever, so we can kind of get where your spectrum of what you like and don't like from the challenge comes from? Because it's one of the great things about this big, vibrant challenge audience that I've been pretty shocked by, honestly. I knew there was obviously, not my opinions were not the only opinions, that some people loved certain seasons, some people hated certain players, whatever. But having done, 16, 17 seasons into this rewatch series, I have been blown away by some of the seasons where I'm like, yeah, it wasn't that good. You can kind of tell if you listen that I'm like not super excited about it the way like I am about a season like the one we're talking about today. And then I'll get messages from people like, how dare you? Like, that's my favorite season. It's so amazing. Or like, you don't like this person? You thought they weren't like good? Like, what are you talking about? And I'm just like, I'm glad everyone's got their defenders. Every season's got their defenders, but I wasn't anticipating how different everyone's opinions could be. So give us a little rundown of maybe your couple favorites or least favorites to give us an idea your challenge taste.
Yeah, as far as seasons go, when if I'm asked like on the spot, what are like your favorite seasons of the challenge? The ones that immediately come to mind are the one we're going to be covering today. So Fresh Meat 2. I gravitate towards Cutthroat a lot, believe it or not, and I
Okay.
gravitate towards Rivals too. those would probably be in my top three in terms of enjoyment. If I were to tell a casual fan who's just kind of, watching for the first time and wants to get into it, I would tell them those are the seasons you might want to check out. They're easy to follow, in my opinion, and I thought the concepts and challenges behind them were also really cool and unique as well. Those are my three favorite. If I'm ever just bored one day and I just want to go back and enjoy and watch something, those are like the three that I would go back and watch. So those are my three favorite seasons. As far as least favorites go, might be recency bias here. I might want to just list off
say it. Everyone says it. It's okay.
I think the last, Total Madness was okay, but I honestly didn't even watch 37.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well,
I watched the premiere of 37 and then I just kind of, tuned out. But if I just want to go basically based on old seasons, The Island probably goes near the bottom of my list. Surprisingly, Duel 2 wasn't as great as I expected it would be.
Whoa. That's okay. Now we've got to something. I'm glad. I was like, I'm starting to get the feeling like we're going to agree on just so many things throughout the day. But now that's no longer true, because how dare you? The Duel 2 is damn near perfect. It is it's a very well produced season, which is sometimes can be hard to find in the challenge world, as recent seasons are definitely bringing back into the forefront production related issues. But I love the Duel 2. It is a touch boring at times compared to other seasons of the challenge.
It wasn't a bad
compared to other things, but
yeah,
I've got a lot of love for that season. What about cast members then?
Cast members, as far as favorites go, I'm obviously going to be a big Landon fan. I'm a fan of Jordan's. If you ask me right now who I think the greatest of all time is, I would say CT. Just based on kind of like the volume of his wins, not necessarily the number of his wins. I would gravitate towards them right now as far as, the male cast members go. This is going to be a wild answer for female cast members. My favorite female cast member is Teresa.
All right. Yes.
I think if we're just speaking to like prime Teresa, she has like the total package for like a cast member I think you want. Is not afraid to make messy political moves, is a good athlete, performs well in dailies. The drama factors there, the competition factors there. Obviously the elimination record doesn't really speak too well, but I think if you really analyze her seasons, you would think like the elimination record is more deceiving.
Yeah, and a little indicative of her partners.
Yeah,
too. She didn't necessarily always win her half of the battle in some of those eliminations either, but was a much more even matchup when, like the X's two, she's an even matchup when her and Wes lose, and it's Wes getting destroyed by Leroy, as everyone pretty much on that season got destroyed by Leroy deservingly, and working with Jay on double agents or whatever. Yeah. And so, who I love Jay, but again, didn't quite stack up when it came to who they then had to go against and whatnot. Although she ended up going out solo to Casey, but that's fair. Okay. I'm with you on Teresa, and I think exactly correct of thinking of like great cast member, not like who's the best competitor at it, which, anytime anyone talks about like the best person on the show or whatever, it's like, well, I need you to qualify. What are you actually asking me here? You actually ask me who I think is the best at winning the challenge and like doing the stuff, or like the best for the show, or a mixture of that or whatever. Is there anyone that would be polarizing on your, I don't really like or vibe with this person, that most people would?
That's interesting, because after kind of interviewing so many people, it's leveled me out a lot to where I kind of want to give them the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because when it comes to interviewing, you're kind of forced to be neutral, or at least I am. So at the moment, I can't really quite pinpoint, and plus I'll get myself in trouble considering I talked like that.
It's all good.
Yeah.
I'm with you on, I'm to like a fault really bad at like giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, and especially like the older cast members that as we go through these seasons and like some of them act like complete pieces of shit. Like, I am the easiest and quickest, as anyone who's been listening to this and has already listened to the Island rewatch knows, like I'm a little bit too much of an apologist sometimes of like, obviously this person's a way better person now than they were then. And like, do you have any track, like anything to go off of with that? I don't, not really, but like, I would like to believe it. And so that's what I'm going with. And so, yeah, I'm with you both of, if you're going to talk to him, of course you got to go in neutral and like want to, dig in or find out why, ask some of the reason, like if a bunch of fans aren't a big fan of this person, maybe why, or get the real story behind it. Because all this stuff is highly edited. They're trying to craft a narrative about each and every one of the people. And I think one too many times I've found out via interviews like the ones that you do about someone who's like, yeah, in this season, this is actually like what was happening. And they used kind of these 3 clips. And the only part I was involved was like as like a villain for this storyline. And I was briefly in it, but like that wasn't, anything that happened, or like me and this person actually liked each other. Like we were in the same room and we hung out, but like that one time we kind of got in an argument was the only thing that they put in the whole season. So now people think like we hate each other or whatever. So I've been burned one too many times by the editing to know that I'm just really easy to forget and forgive. And if you're bringing interesting things to the show, that's all I care about. If you're super duper boring and for some reason they're still inviting you back, that's the only time I'm like, I don't dislike these people as people, but the obvious current example being Casey, incredible competitor, absolutely kicks ass, is one of the favorites to win anytime she steps on, no matter who her partner would end up being. But it is, if you're completely in the background of an entire season, which I know you didn't end up watching, but she's dating Nani. There's no one in the history of the show. A lot of people have dated Nani in the history of the show, and never has it been a background non-story, even possibly because they haven't been great relationships in the past, and the current one is wonderful. Shout out Casey and Nani. But you're winning the season and dating Nani the whole season, and somehow you're barely on the screen. That just tells me that, maybe you're just too nice and good of a person, and you're just not, maybe you're not meant for the TV part. You're definitely meant for the sport part. So,
I'm with you.
It is what it is. Yeah. All right. So we've got a little basis to work off of here. And thankfully, for one of the few seasons that has no bananas or CT, so we don't have to get into that argument, because that's the only other thing I disagreed with you there. But I know slowly but surely over the last couple of years, I've been abandoned on my island, that I can't believe I am the only one out here left in the challenge fandom standing by bananas is better than CT. But that's for a different podcast that will be its own marathon podcast of breaking that down one day. Let's move into this season, Fresh Meat 2. And we will start, for those who have been listening to these rewatches for a while, we're slowly but surely kind of changing up how we do it a little bit, as we've incorporated some guest co-hosts, and it's not just me out here monologuing for days, but we're still pretty much sticking to the same categories. We're going to start with a little high level, just come to some of the basics of the seasons, move into breaking down, the 4 or 5 biggest storylines, and then of course hand out all the awards. We always got to hand out a bunch of awards here, which will also give us a chance to talk about some of the non-big headline storyline aspects of the season. So we're going to start high level and where the challenge was at this time, which actually, before we do, I guess my final question then for you, Mike, if you popped in with, Duel 2 era right before this season, have you gone back and watched most of the stuff from before, at least that's available out there? I'm guessing you're at your age, you've never had a chance to watch seasons 1 through 9, because they just still won't put them out anywhere in the world.
Well, I've got some good people within the fandom who have access to these seasons that I've been able to gone back and
good.
watch out. So yeah, I've gotten a basis of those earlier seasons, luckily. But
okay, good. And well, it's very important for this season too, because of the storylines coming in. I liked what you said earlier about this season being one of the ones that is really, really easy to follow. That's one of the many things we're about to touch on that makes it so good. And it's both, you do need to know everything coming in with this cast, but also if this was the first season you ever watched, it wouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes to figure out, like, okay, there's a reason these two are the focus. They clearly hate each other. I'll figure out why they hate each other so much later on, but you can tell who's versus who, what's going on, what the strategy is the whole way through. So the state of the challenge at the time, the road rules is gone. It's been long gone. We're now on like season 4 or 5 of casting without any road rules to pull from, and really season like 7 or 8, because Viewers Revenge, again, as I say repeatedly, was not, we probably shouldn't even really count that as a season of the road rules. But the Real World has found its footing again. It kind of had that one Hollywood season where it's like, oh my God, is the Real World done? And it's like, nope, it's not. We got Brooklyn, we got Cancun, we've got great cast members coming into the challenge and great Real World seasons. But the challenge is still, because Road Rules has been gone for a while, they are needing to pull people from new shows. They've got this reputation. It's noticeable that they're starting to get to more of like 20 to 24 cast members a season is the number, versus there's a kind of 10 season stretch there where it was like, if we can do 30 in a season, we're going to do 30. But clearly they need people still. They've had a bunch of OGs kind of retire from the show. And so for this season, they bring back Fresh Meat 2. Fresh Meat was the first time they ever brought anyone from non-Road Rules Real World. They clearly feel both from a format, it worked so well the first time, but also just, we need another injection of new cast members. They bring it in, they bring back Fresh Meat 2. Mike, do you feel similar about Fresh Meat as you do Fresh Meat 2? And do you like the Fresh Meat concept in general? Are you okay with them bringing people into the show who had not previously been on, not just not been on Road Rules or Real World, but not been on any show, which was kind of the big, I think, part for some of the cast that was like, it's not even that they weren't on those 2 shows, it's that they weren't on any show. That kind of ruffled some feathers.
I think that I'm okay with it, simply due to the fact that most of those people that are getting pulled onto those shows anyway were like finalists for either the Road Rules or Real World. So, I mean, if they weren't on an original show, it wasn't maybe because they couldn't be on the show. It's just numbers at that point, right? Like, you're only allowed 7 people at most, to be on Road Rules or Real World. So it wasn't necessarily an indictment of like, oh, these guys might not be a fit for the show. It's just they didn't make, the initial cut of being on a Real World season. But obviously production saw fit for them here. So it wasn't like they weren't good enough. It's just that they maybe thought that they were a better fit on the challenge. I mean, look at Laurel for an example. You know what I mean? She was a finalist for Real World Brooklyn, I believe. I think if you look at those 2 seasons, Fresh Meat 2 and Real World Brooklyn, it's very clear that the right decision was made.
Yeah, I kind of can't imagine Laurel in a Real World house at that Brooklyn. Time. Like, Brooklyn, and just, Laurel today, sure, but Laurel of this moment in her life. But yeah, I feel like it would have been great, actually, as far as, it would have added even more drama to that house and that season. But it's spot on that, yeah, it definitely helps that all these people were, they were cast for those shows to begin with, and it was just the numbers thing, like you said, which makes it way better and way more kind of acceptable to fans and I think cast members alike than like today, when some people are kind of upset with like, this person was on what show, this person's just an influencer, like, and they get to come on or whatever. It was like, no, like the Laurels, like they were in the final round. Like, you might know them. They might have been supposed to have been on a season, like John A, I know, was like a couple seasons in a row before Cancun, where it was like, she was going to be on Fresh Meat 1. She was going to be on this season. Then she finally ends up on a Real World season. That made it, fit a lot more. But clearly the producers also are smart enough to realize, like, you can't have a Laurel or Teresa, for that matter, walk in and when you realize we don't have a spot for them on, on whatever next Real World season is, if they would have passed up meeting Laurel in person and not being like, you should be on this other thing we got going, like, I feel like that's going to work out really well for you, that would have just been an incredible disservice to the fandom. So they knew what they were doing.
Apparently Teresa was actually like offered a spot for Hollywood season, but then opted to go back to school for another semester. So then they ended up using her and saving her for Fresh Meat 2. Imagine that.
What a fantastic decision that she made.
Well, she could have been
the circumstances,
because the lone representative of Hollywood at that point to like carry that season, because that's like kind of referred to as like the go season. That's like one of the, I think, explanations rather for why I think they chose to do a Fresh Meat 2 when they did it, because I think like the payoff for cast members of Hollywood and Brooklyn, they weren't necessarily getting that onto the challenge. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
they kind of got 2 seasons out of Hollywood. It was a quick little flame out, and then they all just kind of went on and didn't do shows after that. And then Brooklyn, I mean, you had Sarah that was perennially doing them, but then there was kind of like a lot of them that didn't do any, and then the ones that did were more sporadic, like Chet and JD and Caitlin.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
they kind of
And
needed to.
yeah, they definitely needed it because, this was peak time. There was about 10 real world seasons in a row that was like, all right, we need 5 of you to be on the next season of the challenge. Like literally like 5 of the 7, you're going to be on the next season. You're all going to do at least one challenge, but like Austin right away, 5 of them did the next 2 seasons that were available. Key West was the same, Philadelphia was the same, and then that really hit a roadblock with Hollywood. But if Teresa was on Hollywood, that means Teresa's first season of the challenge likely would have been the Island, and you know good fucking luck. Just I don't want to be a cast member whose first season is the Island, and I also don't wouldn't have wanted to be a female cast member whose first season of the challenge would have had to be going through
Yeah.
the Island. I don't know that we would have gotten a lot of Teresa after that, because I would think most sane people, if they would have been put in that situation, would like, no, this isn't. This is not what I thought it was going to be. This is not nearly as fun as the house that she eventually ends up in as a rookie in British Columbia. So this season, then, the quick basics of the season. The location is British Columbia. It's fall. We're going to talk about that in a moment. This season airs in, cut this out in a minute, didn't have this ready to go on the side. This season airs in 2010, April to June. We are sticking with what is now 4 or 5 seasons in of the hour-long format, 10-episode season. So less episodes, less time on our calendars, but longer episodes, and only the 1 round per episode, which, much different than the first times they ever tried the hour-long episodes, were basically just 2 30-minute episodes aired back-to-back, where they do the men's round and the women's round over and over. We've got TJ Lavin here, of course, hosting his now 8th straight season in what would become the permanent hosting gig. 10 episodes, a reunion, as well as a special afterwards, and 26 cast members who are as follows: Landon from Philadelphia, Kenny from Fresh Meat, Jillian from Road Rules Extreme, Jen from Denver, Ryan and Ev from Fresh Meat, Wes from Austin, CJ from Cancun, Danny from Austin, Caitlin from Brooklyn, Paula from Key West, Sarah from Brooklyn, and Darrell from Campus Crawl, joined by 13 Fresh Meat: Carly, Laurel, Pete, Noir, Teresa, Luke, Mandy, Sydney, Sandy, Brandon, Jeff, Vinny, and Cara Maria. An absolutely stacked, for the second time in a row, just an incredible group of Fresh Meat that they brought in. They nailed this 2 for 2 for the second time. Just an incredible job. And again, pulling from finalists for their other shows. They were obviously working with, folks they had won it on TV for a reason, and they really nailed it for the second season in a row. Couple quick things on these kind of basics of this season. The location being British Columbia. I am one that is definitely like on record, like warm weather seasons are the best seasons, because, we want them in the pool. We want them having a good time. Generally, we don't want them, bundled up in the rain and the snow all the time for every daily challenge. They're not having as good of a time. It ruins kind of the vibe of the season. But if someone were to tell me they like cold weather seasons, or they aren't like as big on like it has to be like in Mexico in the summer, like, bathing suit weather the whole time, their best evidence to point to would be this season, because we're in British Columbia. It's beautiful and it's fall. We start the season and, they're in the hot tub and stuff, but they're wearing t-shirts and shorts. By the end of the season, it's about to snow. They're climbing a snow-capped mountain. It is very cold. I think it's the only true like fall weather season where we get to see it go from like borderline summer to borderline winter in one season. Are you a team like got to have a warm weather season, or do you like that this season is kind of like, let's actually see 3 seasons in one season?
I agree with the notion that hot weather seasons are kind of essential if you want a good like TV show, both visually and from a standpoint of cast members, like typically are more inclined to be more like, active and like lively during hot weather seasons. But I will say that if you were to ever do a coldish weather season and successfully pull it off, it would be this one.
Yeah,
I
I think it just works so well.
Yeah, this is my favorite house. Like, if anybody who's listened to any of my earlier episodes, when I have Fresh Meat 2 people on, I always talk about this. Is like, I love this house. And that's like actually one of my talking points. I always ask my guests that are from that season, I'm like, that's got to be the best house you've ever been in. And they kind of agree.
With you. That was the next thing to touch on. It's tricky from the outside. I'm glad you've asked so many about it. Obviously, from the outside, we get a great view of the house, but we've never like went through the house or anything. But I do put this one. This is in my top 3 of definitely like the greatest challenge houses they've ever had. Paula says it when they first go in, which someone on every season they get the clip, of
She
course,
said
of saying,
Oprah would
someone
be
saying
jealous.
this is the greatest house in the world. But yeah, she says Oprah would be jealous, and I feel like that's like a true comment. That's not just like we need some. Hey, can someone say that this house is fucking awesome so we can put that in a confessional? It's massive. It's beautiful. I'm a outdoorsy guy. The log cabin vibe, plays to my desires. But while it doesn't have a pool, it's got the hot tub, which is fine. It's like there's just so much room when they have all their parties, which they have many this season. There's so much room. They've got the backyard. They can freaking hit the golf ball around, which I love the couple different golf scenes we get in this season. And just overall, it's so beautiful. It's aesthetically pleasing the whole time. And because it starts and it's warm and we get a lot of hot tub time, we get a lot of party time. The house seems to have good AC and heat, so they can, they don't have to be bundled up while they're in there. It works out really, really well. And that by the end of the season, it's like, oh, things are getting harder, things are getting harder, things are getting harder. And part of it is the elements are getting worse. It's getting colder. Every time they get in the water, it's a little bit worse. The next 3 days later, it's like, God, we have to get in this water again, TJ. It was really cold last time. Like, what are we doing? So love all of that. And the other thing I love about just kind of the basic format of the season is the combine in the draft. So this is one of my biggest challenge stances and opinions. I recently, on my 100th episode, did the 100 challenge takes, and a lot of them were, I had to get to 100. So am I going to fiercely stand by all of them? Maybe not. Maybe I was just trying to get to 100, which is why earlier I didn't hear you should get the shout out to X's too, your most elite season of all time.
Oh,
I thought
yeah.
we'd get that in your favorite seasons ever. But one of those was that the draft, the idea of a draft for teammates in the world of the challenge, is 3 for 3 of holding some sort of combine or one daily challenge in the case of War of the Worlds, and then doing a straight up draft for partners. It's 3 for 3. It works every time. It's amazing every time. And this season, of course, it works flawlessly. Both it's entertaining, it's interesting. I wish we would have seen more of the combine. I'm glad the combine stats exist online to be able to really assess everyone's pick, but it's worked out with the teams that get picked every time, leading to kind of like an interesting set of teams, and just it works out every time. So Mike, I'm not even going to ask should they bring this back in the future season, because if you want to disagree that they shouldn't, go right ahead. But why do you think they have not attempted a combine and draft style again? Or do you think they're only willing to do that on a fresh meat style season? Because the third time they do it is War of the Worlds 1, which is essentially fresh meat 3, given that half of the cast is brand new and, from all different places around the world and different TV shows and everything. But it's 3 for 3. It works every time. Why have they not done this more?
That would have been the time to do it, I think. Would have been War of the Worlds 1, right? To do another combine.
They do the daily challenge, which is like, they get to watch them perform or whatever, where they have to like the balls roll down the sandhill and they have to go get one and bring it back up or whatever. So it's kind of like they do it, but they don't do like a combine. And yeah, that would have been great. Can you imagine Paulie Calafiore having to like do a combine on television? You know how into it he would get?
Oh my
just
God.
For that alone. Or War of the Worlds 1, Josh doing a combine for all of us. Like nowadays, right now, present day, Josh would crush a combine. That man he's got the bug. He's absolutely jacked and fit out of his mind. But yeah, it would have been so good.
Passed up on potential good opportunity right there.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's obviously more footage of this Fresh Me 2 combine that exists because, we get the little montage of just some people doing pull-ups,
Yeah.
Noir running, and I mean, they say he ran a 4.8. That man looked like he was going faster than that. If I've watched my fair share of NFL combines, I feel like he was even lower. But yeah,
surprisingly, the guys that put up the best numbers, aside from Noor, obviously, were Luke and Jeff. They actually surprised.
Yeah. So we're going to come back to Jeff's numbers a little bit later on when we talk about who Paula should have picked in the kind of what if around Paula this season. But yeah, Jeff, so they did pull-ups, they do a vertical leap, a 40-yard dash, and then an obstacle course, which has 2 puzzles in it. So on Freshman 1, they had one that was just called like the logic. They just had to do a puzzle or whatever. And someone did in 7 seconds and someone DQ'd after 25 minutes, which is hilarious. But this one, they had to do like run and jump over a wall and then do a puzzle. And yeah, Jeff is a standout. We might as well just say it now. I think I have it later, but we'll reference it again later. One of the best athletic performances of the entire season is Noor, who has the most pull-ups, has the second highest vertical jump, even though he is tiny person. He has by far the fastest 40-yard dash, and he has the fastest obstacle logic puzzle course. So he smoked this whole thing. He was a deserving number 1 pick. Before we talk about some of the other picks that were made, that'll come a little bit later. Let's just move right into, the biggest storylines of the season. And there's one that is obvious and that we will, of course, talk about in depth, which is Wes and Ev versus Kenny. But before we do, to lead into that, we have to talk, we've already kind of talked about it a little here. The casting job on this season is another one of my real big takes about the challenge and opinions that I'll always hold is this is the best job casting ever did in the history of the show, because the job of casting isn't necessarily to just get the biggest names possible. There's other seasons. I think if I have to pick, The Duel is probably the best cast ever as far as the 20 people that are on The Duel 1, 16 of them are all-time Hall of Fame level names or whatever. So if you're just going big names or whatever, that one, is reigns supreme, and there's a bunch of them that are like that. But this one, the real job to me of casting isn't just let's get the biggest names possible and see what happens. It's to actually think through in advance, who are we casting? What kind of roles to some degree do we want them to play? And more so, what do we think this cast brings us an opportunity-wise? What storylines do they have from the past that coming in that we can kind of force to happen? So with this cast, they knew as they did this, we are not going to invite Johnny Bananas. We're not going to invite CT because we've had this thing between Wes and Kenny going for multiple seasons in a row, but we haven't. And, we just came off the Ruins where they were on it together and, sparks flew, but it was kind of everyone versus Wes. It wasn't just Kenny versus Wes. And they knew coming into this, we're not going to have any of these other big guys that are going to, suck up oxygen. We're going to have Wes and Kenny. We're going to add Evelyn to it because Evelyn also hates Kenny and will be on Wes's side. And then otherwise, we're not going to have big heavy hitter names. We're going to have a Landon as the best, Landon and Darrell as the best, big names coming in, but they're both quieter. They're not trying to dominate storylines. They're trying to sit in the back. We want this to be Wes and Evelyn versus Kenny. They knew that going in. They created the opportunity for that to happen, which it, of course, then plays out perfectly for them. But between knowing Jen, Ryan, Sarah, Paula, Jill, even Danny, if I regrettably have to add him to the list, those are the perfect secondary players that are going to be really, really good. They're professionals at this point. They're going to be awesome, but they're also going to have no problems with going in day one and just looking around and being oh yeah, we're going to frame all of this as it's these two guys going against each other. So that's a long-winded, it's one of my favorite arguments to make, but do you agree that, the job of casting isn't necessarily just big names, but is to try to manufacture or create, not in a fake way, but in a, if we put these people together, this mix, these are the possible results and we'll hope for the best, that's the real job, and that this season they just absolutely nailed that?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's probably somewhat of an emphasis actually on that, with judging by how big that storyline was over the last few seasons leading up to that. they probably geared that entire thing around those two guys, but we're like, let's not include, Kenny's usual band of guys that kind of like run the show. We're gonna have him on his own and then kind of see like how he acts without having his like heavy hitters behind him to help, control the game like he usually does. And they had like a good mix of like secondary people because they were all like middle ground people, usually people that aren't used to playing like a totally political game. Like, notoriously we don't really see like Jen and Ryan or like Landon ever having to like really pick sides, you know what I mean? And this was one of those games where it was like you either had to pick Kenny or Wes. And I
Yeah,
enjoyed that because it was a good play on the game, but it was more of a even bigger play around just their rivalry in general.
yeah. And I just think, I mean, again, it has to work out, but I think this was very purposeful by them picking these people for exact reasons. And then it did just, it played out perfectly. And, that's also a thing with production of the show. Sometimes things work out exactly as you want and give you the best case thing. Sometimes they don't, but it's about creating the opportunity for really great stuff to happen. And they did that this season. And then the cast itself and how it all unfolded delivered on that for sure. So let's get into then the Wes and Ev versus Kenny rivalry on this season. It's, it more than almost any season ever before this, usually when I'm doing the main storylines of a season, some seasons it's like, I don't even know what there wasn't one overarching one. There's kind of like 5 or 6 that happened for 3 episodes or whatever. Some seasons it's like, yeah, these 2 or 3 things were the big one. This season is one where it's like, no, if we only had to talk about one storyline, we'd still pretty much cover most of the season because it's really just every episode. The only thing, the focus is Wes's side versus Kenny's side. And I got to make sure it's always Wes and Evelyn's side. It's, framed a little more Wes versus Kenny, but it's just as much. If Wes wasn't there, this would have played out exactly the same, just with Ev versus Kenny, and like Evelyn would have been on her own as like the only person on that side. But everything would have happened the exact same. They, for different reasons, both had a lot of history and a lot of beef with Kenny. I will at some point read through the episode by episode how this goes down, but there's kind of 2 halves to how this rivalry goes and who's kind of winning, who's not, and how it impacts the season. So the early part is the first couple episodes. Wes's political brilliance, which he, gives himself plenty of credit for over the years, and most fans would agree he does. It's mostly deserved to say like he is one of the master manipulators in the history of this game. If there's anyone out there that's ever like, Wes isn't actually that good at this, or like Wes is like political social game, like it's just a bunch of talk, this is the season you'd go watch, or he would probably point them to like, just watch the first 3 episodes of Fresh Meat 2. Stop there. Don't stop there, because then it goes downhill. But the first couple episodes, Wes's sway in the house, his brilliance as a manipulator and a politician is on full display, most notably right the first day, the first daily challenge. It ends, Kenny and Laurel have won, but Wes immediately pulls Kenny aside and for one single episode gets him on his team, and not only gets Kenny on his side of things, in a matter of like 2 minutes, they are able to get the entire house to vote the exact same way, the entire house. And, Kenny even comments on it after the fact of like, holy cow, like, I can't believe this guy. Like, we had 5 minutes between getting home from the daily challenge and we did this vote. And every single person in this house raised their hands exactly when Wes wanted them to. I cannot believe someone did this. So the start of this game is all Wes all the time. He's got the numbers, he gets everyone on his side, and he's running things. And is this, I mean, where does this stand as far as, I don't remember many seasons, even if it doesn't last, that anyone ever had like this type of control over a house so quickly, to truly have every single person doing exactly what you want on day one. I don't think we've seen this before.
No, I think this was like a masterclass through 3 episodes, of course. Obviously, we know how it ended up turning out, but had the daily challenges gone a different way this season, we possibly could have looked at the way it was, at least up to that point, like the trajectory speaking. Had Laurel and Kenny not dominated the dailies the way they did, this possibly could have went on to be the greatest political season we might have ever seen in challenge history, had Wes done better in the daily challenges and gotten more of the control over it.
Yeah, I'm right with you. I mean, it really truly is, through the first 5 episodes, Wes and Ev are running every single thing. Every single decision is theirs. The only thing thwarting this is the fact that Kenny and Laurel win 4 of the first 5 daily challenges. And as the main target for Wes and Ev, that, always ends up being then one of your side versus one of our side, because we both get to pick someone to go in. The other part of the real kind of feather in his cap, if you will, for Wes in this early part is he brings in Landon, and there's 2 of them. We'll talk about both. The first one is he brings in Landon, which no one had ever done before. Landon had done 3 seasons of the show. Yes, 2 of them team-based where, the alliances aren't going to be as big of a deal, but still those seasons had their alliances within them and certain things. And he was just, notorious for, I'm not taking part in that. I'm here to have a good time. I think everyone will realize that I'm way better at this than everyone else. And so I'm not going to be like a target. You want me here when we're on teams. And then, on the duel 2, it ultimately is his downfall a little bit that he is so against alliances or deals or anything that he's the one not thinking to the level of being willing to leave a room when 4 people are trying to decide who's going to go in elimination. One of the biggest what if moments in challenge history, because then Landon could be the greatest of all time, if not for that one single moment where he had to leave the room to get a hat. Just
what do you think would have, not to change gears too much, but very quickly, if we were to say right now on that,
Brad and Evan would have went into the Mark wouldn't have let Landon go in for sure.
So you think it would have been
Evan the 3 of them would have said, Brad, you're going in. And I think Brad would have called out Evan over Landon because of the duels they were going with that year. One of them, the one they ended up doing consequentially, so it would have potentially backfired. Size mattered in a really big way. 2 of them, I guess, because the push off one, but the other couple being a big dude really hurt you. The puzzle, like the wall puzzle that they had to do, and especially where they had to sit on the little thing and pull the elevator. That one, as we later saw for Evan in the final, was where he almost blew. We ended up seeing that Brad versus Evan in that essentially at the very end of the final. I think he would have called out Evan just from a ties and like 50-50 shot of whether I want a big guy or not. So, and I think Mark and Landon would have defended themselves if the 4 of them actually had to like really chop it up over like who should go in. So yeah, and actually I get into that on the Duel 2 podcast, which we're recording this on a Sunday. That podcast hopefully is coming out tomorrow before this one will eventually run a little ways down the road. I still have to finish that season and finish that podcast, but that's for later today. For now, Wes brings in Landon. He knows that, Landon is the only one in the house who kind of, after winning the second daily challenge, has a shot to actually win some of these dailies. Wes already sees, I kind of don't. I hope Evelyn does. His whole alliance rides on like, can Evelyn and Luke win a daily challenge? And they never do. But he brings in Landon, which is a huge deal. He goes, he plays golf with them. And then he also has the very memorable conversation immediately afterwards where they let Kenny know, like, hey, just so you know, Landon's going to say your name. I think Wes uses multiple times this season, like I contracted or I played, I think he says I played golf with him for an hour and I brought him in. And it's like very like Wes works for the CIA or something like this season. Like it's all like the lingo is there. And the fact that he gets Landon of all people to agree to a deal and to pick his side, because I do think between the 2 of them, Landon doesn't really have a history with either Wes or Kenny or Evelyn for that matter. No strong ones, at least. And so that was the biggest early domino, was to get Landon on one side or the other. And Wes is able to do it. And I wonder, have you spoken to Landon before? You've had him on, right? Yeah. Did you ask him at all about this, or what his reasoning for finally being willing to join one, or maybe if he said anything about like picking Wes over Kenny in that moment?
He said it was just a matter of who came to him first, pretty much.
Yeah.
Like he didn't really prefer necessarily one over the other. He was just, Wes got to him before Kenny did.
Yeah.
And you even
I-
see kind of with the dialogue when Kenny asks Landon straight up, like, you really think he'll keep you around here that long? And then he's like, no, but longer than you.
yeah.
So, I mean,
It's the sad part about Landon never wanting to play the political game is that he's a very astute person, and I feel like he like could read people as well as most of the people in this house and stuff, and that I feel like he would have just been really good at it because he can also kind of keep his emotions in check and like be calm and reserved, and he ends up having some real political brilliance through this game on his own. So it's kind of a bummer that, of course, it's just a bummer we never got more Landon after this, but it's a bummer that he never really tried to use that tool in the tool belt that it seemed like he did have if he was willing to wield it. So the other one that Wes gets to that a lot of credit for and is a really good kind of moment in time to look back and kind of was a shifting in how the challenge was played before every season. It took a while for this to start happening, but I think this is certainly the first ever case where there is a preseason. It's not the first ever case that there's a preseason alliance, but of this sort between Wes and Jen. I feel bad that I even almost references the first ever when we got my guy Theo Vaughn and Dan Setzler and Mark and Eric back on Battle of the Sexes 2 is the first kind of known pre-show alliance that was discussed. But on this one, Wes and Jen, way before the show, come into this show with a contract, as Wes says, for Jen to go and join the opposite alliance. However the house ends up being, I don't think they know going in who's all there. They don't know for sure it's going to be Kenny. It works out even better that it is because Jen has enough of a history with him to be able to like say, like, of course I would pick you too. But for Jen to go into the house, pick the other alliance and join it, vote against Wes twice in a row, and then at some just act as a mole the whole time where the whole time he'll know, she'll know, they won't tell anyone else, including their partners, and that at some point she will flip back to them. What was your, because this is also part of a pretty iconic moment that we'll talk about when we hand out that award of Jen and Mandy's fight and Jen's big monologue of, you're fresh meat. If you don't know what's going on, I'm doing my job, baby. I'm doing my job or whatever. And it's all because of this hidden alliance and her voting against Wes and Mandy, even though that's what she's supposed to do. What did you think of when you see that they've won to this level? They've gone to like preseason negotiations and contracts to put together alliances in the house, and how sneaky it was. It was really well thought out. It didn't ultimately play out to actually benefit Wes ever down the line, but in the moment when it's a pretty shocking moment when they reveal, midway through, this is what's really going on.
it's one of those moments that kind of like goes under the radar, I think, a little bit, but like kind of like an underestimated like political move in the sense of like how calculated it was. That just like to me shows like how far ahead that like West thinks in these games. And I think like during that time period in which the show was, stuff like that didn't really like exist, you know what I mean? Like you'd probably more so see maybe today something like that happen. But like preseason alliance, especially like the plan that they had in particular, that was like one of the more underrated moves, I would say, because it doesn't really get talked about a lot. Like it's kind of right, like guns swept under the rug a little bit.
Yeah, and that's definitely because it, ultimately it never comes back to actually help Wes at any point. It does give us this iconic fight between Jen and Mandy and then the reveal after the fact, but Wes never actually gets to then use his mole to his advantage. But it's just a clear example of it's what separated Wes then for sure in the game and was a big part of why, he won 2 seasons like earlier on in his challenge career. And it still separates him a bit today, but in a different point of the scale. But he just takes it way more serious than everyone else. He is the one that's like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to like do this. I'm going to like think through every nuance of this. I'm going to give my everything to this. And I am going to just take it more serious than everyone else, from working out, getting ready for it, from planning, from trying to think of strategy, trying to make the right friendships, whatever. He just took it way more serious than everyone, which is a huge benefit. And if you're playing a game and you're just at a different level of how much you care and how serious you're taking it and what level you're playing it at, obviously you're going to do better. And I still think that's true today. It's just that there's a lot more others that also take it very seriously. But even so, I feel like Wes is, even modern day Wes, the reason he just won All Stars 3 is because he still takes it way more serious than everyone else. His training, everyone trains for the show now, but his training is off the charts. He's, in incredible shape these days. He's still thinking through things. He's still he's talking to every single cast member that he finds out is on the season. He's talking to everyone before he goes on there. He's making deals. He's letting things be known. He just takes it more seriously, and that makes, for a great player. And that definitely, I think, between CT gets a lot of credit for just being like the guy on the show that everyone became scared of physically, and that elevated, the physical nature of the show. And that Bananas gets a lot of credit for, like, he made it a little more vindictive, or the alliances and the backstabbing, but also the like physicality and the athleticism, that like him and some other folks kind of brought the game, evolved the game to where it was. But I think Wes doesn't get enough credit for, like, he's the first one who was like, you guys know we can focus on winning this. Like, we could try really hard to win this, right? And like kind of started to change the game and make it more serious, make it more cutthroat and political. Because, there's been alliances for many seasons coming into this, but there hadn't been this level of like this kind of attempt at manipulation or attempt at numbers and everything else. And for many seasons after this, like, Wes is still one of the main ones who's like actually trying to game out the whole chessboard, not just like, I need like 2 people that will vote with me or whatever. He's trying to go all out all the time.
Yeah, I think it's because like the wins maybe aren't, I think everybody kind of measures wins instead of like gameplay and moves, so to speak. Like, you could have like great game plans or game plays, but if you don't win, people seem to kind of just like put it out of their brain. But like, I look at it from like all different perspectives. Like, if someone has like more wins than him for let's just say, but like their wins weren't necessarily like as impressive, then I'll be like, all right, well, the guy with the better gameplay, I still kind of hold more weight to. You know what I mean?
For sure. And, this is a perfect example of where possibly playing the game that hard and having that level of strategy and everything can backfire too. It may not always work. It may not lead to as many wins as you would think. The guy who is in as good a shape as anyone, takes it more serious than anyone, would have a few more wins than even he does. And that's because after 2 or 3 episodes or, rounds of daily and elimination, as much as they're running the game, as much as they have the numbers on their side, Kenny and Laurel keep winning, which means it's still one of ours versus one of theirs. One of Kenny's side continues to win every single time, and he slowly but surely, completely and utterly dismantles Wes's alliance. I'm going to quickly run through the episode by episode because this is just truly crazy how this happens. So episode 1, they work together. They take a shot at Darrell. It works. Darrell's out of the game. Great. They work together for 1 episode. Episode 2 is when Wes brings in Landon. They send Kenny into exile. The only time Kenny and Laurel end up in exile, he has to go against his number 1 ally, Sarah. They take Sarah out. Kenny's still in the game. Kenny wins the daily in the 3rd episode, but Wes has all the votes. Ev ends up going in versus Paula. Ev beats Paula in exile. And at this point, after 3 episodes, you're like, all right, yeah, Laurel and Kenny are going to win all these dailies. But like, Wes has literally like 2 times the amount of votes in the house as Kenny and Laurel's side. And we're about to find out technically also has Jen and maybe even Ryan, who are half of the votes that Kenny thinks he has. We get to the 4th episode. Wes gets Ryan to trick Kenny into saying CJ and Sydney because he thinks that Ryan is going to go in, which was Ryan's plan the whole time. Wes was going to throw in Pete and Jill, but Caitlin gets hurt that episode. So they make maybe their first mistake of the season, Wes and Ev, by saying, out of fairness, we're going to put Brandon and Caitlin in. We'll talk about that DQ later on, but they don't go with Pete and Jill. So then we get to episode 5. The numbers have shifted for the first time as, Wes and Ev lose someone. Kenny and Laurel win again. The Wes Ryan trick works again. And Wes is okay with Danny and Sandy getting called out just so that he himself isn't chosen. They throw in Pete and Jill. Pete and Jill smoke Danny and Sandy. And now Wes has lost for the 2nd time in a row, lost someone on his team. And that's when the big mistake happens. Episode 6. Kenny and Laurel let Pete and Jill win the daily challenge. They get to a final round, those two teams versus each other. Pete and Jill are like, hey, we've gone in a bunch. Like, would you guys mind taking this one for us? Kenny and Laura say yes, because we also think that they're too scared of us to put us in exile, which is true. And Wes and Ev, to save their own ass, make a deal with Kenny to put Landon versus CJ, which in reality completely and utterly backfires because it gives Kenny the entire house against the two of Wes and Ev, because when Landon comes back, Wes and Ev have lost CJ, and they have also effectively lost Landon. And that is the moment where Kenny, I can't believe I'm saying these words out loud or that I typed these words on notes. Like, it was checkmate. It was over. It was absolutely brilliant from him to, in that moment, realize you're trying to make this deal with me. You realize it's only going to save you from one exile, right? Like, it completely dismantles their team. And in that moment, this is definitely their biggest mistake. But what doesn't it just make sense? Why did Wes not just say that he would go against Ryan and Teresa and try to win and save numbers? That part, I know they had been working together a little bit, the last few episodes before that. Ryan had helped Wes out, but it feels like, they try to save themselves both. And in the end, that just means you two are going in next. You've actually just flipped the entire house around from 4-2 on one side to 4-2 the other way. And it feels like Wes should have been like, just throw me in. We're going to throw in Ryan and Teresa, and I'll take my chances winning an exile and keeping the numbers on my side.
I think he just scrambled. I think like he got caught up in his own like ego at the time, that I think like he just like couldn't like face the fact that like he was actually going to have to go in.
Yeah.
And plus like him and Teresa had like a thing going on that season, so maybe that played a part in it.
I wonder how much that did play a part in it, because he was kind of, I think that's the same episode, or maybe it's the one right after that where Evelyn finally like calls Wes out on like right in front of Teresa of like, so my best friend Kellyanne, who you're still kind of dating, right? Kind of maybe still dating her, right? How's she gonna feel about this?
That's a funny thing too, because he came in on the first episode saying like they weren't dating anymore, but when I interviewed Kellyanne, she said that like they technically were agreed to like not see other people like during the show.
And that's like, what Ev says, I think, to him on screen of like, you guys hooked up the weekend before you came and you said you wouldn't like get with anyone. I know you're not dating, but like you said, you're still essentially exclusive. So that makes it even more fascinating that Ev and Wes worked together the whole season. But yeah, I think Wes is just kind of hubris of, I could throw in Landon and CJ because Jen and Ryan are kind of technically working for me, and they're not going to like get upset by this. And it's like, yeah, they are. Like, you just threw half of your alliance in to save your own ass. That obviously makes everyone else be like, well, we're not trusting them. It's Wes and Ev and no one else. No one else actually matters to them. And then by the time the 7th episode kicks off, Kenny, the whole time, who has just told anyone who would listen to him, like, if you are with me, I will never like throw you under the bus. I'll never do anything. And to his credit, for this particular season, that is 100% true. He's loyal the whole way through. That's the best decision that Jill and Pete ever make, is choosing that side over Wes's side, even if it would have saved them from a couple exiles to start the season. Panned out really well for them at the end. Landon wins a daily. They throw Wes and Evelyn in versus each other. Evelyn takes out Wes. The next time, Evelyn gets thrown right back in versus Landon, gets beat. She's gone. And we get ultimately to the final 4 of this season. Landon and Carly end up in it because the last daily is, purge style-esque, where the bottom 2 go to elimination. But if not for that, Landon and Carly are in another elimination at the end. And if they were to lose, the final 4 of this season, 4 of the final 5, and what could have been the final 4, are the 4 teams from Kenny's alliance the entire time. Like, after all of it, it's Laurel and Kenny, Jill and Pete, Ryan and Teresa, Jen and Noor. And that's basically Kenny's alliance for the majority of the season. And it's just really an incredible turnaround. And I forgot to give the disclaimer at the start of all of this that I have to do on certain seasons of anyone who has been banned from the show or canceled in challenge fandom. We talk about these seasons as if we were talking about them right after them, without any of the other facts. Obviously, this season takes place after the ruins, but we don't know anything about what would come of that season until many seasons later in the timeline. And so it's up for being talked about and discussed on the merits of their season, the season we're talking about them. So, there's no way getting around Kenny being the incredible focus of the season, and the fact that he played an incredible season. He had a couple brilliant moves. He dominated the whole season along with Laurel, and that's a lot more Laurel than Kenny. But for the first time, Kenny's usually the one getting kind of helped by his partners or teammates the most. For the first time, which would become 2 times in a row when we add in rivals to it, he's carrying his weight. Laurel's also just, incredibly dominant. But he's also like loyal and nice to everyone in the house, which is an interesting turn of, change of pace, and is one of the big casting related things that, I think you had referenced earlier, not bringing in the Evans or the Johnnies or all his buddies. It not only makes the game more interesting, but it also helps some of the shit that had went down on a Ruins or the Island, where it's like these guys that, maybe when they get all together, they're, pretty mean to a lot of other people around them. When you separate them out, it turns out for this single season, Kenny's a nice guy. Everyone likes him. Everyone has fun with him there. He's like, he's still kind of busting people's chops a little bit, but like in an actual fun way that like people are doing it back. There's a hilarious scene where I think it's on one of the credit scenes, which they should bring back the end credit scenes because they're always hilarious, where Kenny wakes Noor up by throwing a roll of toilet paper at his face. And then Noor the next day comes back and gets a wet roll of toilet paper and throws it at Kenny's face while he's sleeping on the couch. And like, it's actually like everyone's like, no, we're in on it. We're all doing it together, whatever. So it's an incredible season from him. And it's an incredible just meltdown from Wes and Evelyn to allow Kenny, of all people, to somewhat outsmart them. And I think while it is swept under the rug a little, the decision that they make, the singular decision of let's save our own ass for this one, let's team back up with this guy, but ultimately ruins their season. I don't know that there's ever been, we mentioned, the early political brilliance has maybe never been matched from Wes, but also the incredibly quick fall, I feel like has never been matched of like, you guys had this game and somehow, some way, yes, it was partly because they kept winning dailies, but also like, how did you blow this? How did it end up being just 4 people from Kenny's alliance basically in the finals? Is incredible. I have no idea how it happened. I don't feel like I can remember any other time where someone went from so on top to so on the bottom so fast.
No, it's probably one of the, if not the biggest, like kind of collapse in a challenge season, I think. Can you name another time? Because I kind of can't. Like right off.
War of the Worlds 2 comes to mind, but that one is also even more, this one is a lot to do with Laurel and Kenny winning and winning and winning. War of the Worlds 2 is because Jordan and Tori, get the turncoat and get to go on the other team. But like that one was one where it's like Paulie and Kara are in charge of this game and Cam are in charge of it. They're winning every single challenge over and over. They're literally manipulating the other team into like, this is who you should throw in, this is who you should get rid of. Joss, yeah, you're working with us, buddy. Like, we're going to dismantle your team and you're going to be okay with it. And then just right at the end, it flips because Jordan and Tori win and flip to the other side, and then win the one fatal error. They let them have CT for a final when they could have had CT from the start. So that one comes to mind.
Wes again on X's too, probably. But I mean, that's kind of
that's tainted. Another twist related one. Yeah, it's like that's the other. This season is production's casting decisions playing out as perfectly as they could have ever hoped. X's 2 is where a twist has never played out better than them being like, this is when we introduced the Redemption House, and it worked out so perfectly that it ends up being Bananas and Nani coming back in and then taking out Wes and Teresa. And so yeah, that one, he had that game by the throat too, and that's just a complete like, that's not on you, man. Like, that's bullshit that the guy you worked so hard to get out comes back in, and now suddenly just out of nowhere you're like, wait, I was in the final, I was probably winning the final, and now suddenly just the never before seen twist is just gonna, I'm out. Like, I have to go into elimination versus Leroy. What the fuck? Like, how
they would have won that season, him and Teresa.
Yeah. So that's not really on. I don't like put that one as like much of a collapse, as it's just like a completely cruel twist of fate of like, the twists are the twists. They're there for a reason. And that one panned out great for viewership and entertainment, horrible for Wes. So that's kind of the main thing of the season, is these two versus each other. Wes and Ev got it at the start. They fall apart at the end. Laurel and Kenny the whole time are, making smart moves and also just winning every single thing, which brings us to the actual competition itself. A few things to run through from the competition. We start with Laurel and Kenny. They kick everyone's ass. They win 5 of the 9 dailies. They really win 6 of the 9 because they let Pete and Jill win the final round of the one, as we said before, even though I'm sorry, it's Laurel versus Jill. We see how that ends up later on when they have to wrestle each other through the mud. Another hilarious, sad but hilarious moment where Jill has to crawl by Laurel and just beg her, like, can we not do this? So they really win 6 out of 9. This is the second fresh meat season in a row that this happens, that one team absolutely dominates, but then does not win. The previous time with Coral and Evan is because of injury. I think they maybe not easily win the final. The final maybe would have been slightly different, but easily the best team there. How do these two compare for you? Which one do you feel like was more dominant, Coral and Evelyn or Laurel and Kenny? And is there any other male-female duos you can think of that you would put up on like a similar level of just really, really impossible to beat?
I actually think Kenny and Laurel's was more impressive, just simply due to the outside, factors going into it. You had in the fact of basically their backs were against the wall every single time out. It was kind of like you have to win for Kenny, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you factor that in, it makes it a lot more amplified. But also I think just the competitions had gotten a lot tougher as a whole up to that point than they were during the original fresh meat. So that's probably why I'm leaning more towards the Kenny and Laurel being more impressive than Evan and Coral. As far as duos go, that's a good question.
Because we got X's too, I put Jordan and Sarah pretty high up there at that time, but that's a little more finals based, which is the tricky thing with both Laurel and Kenny here. Would have been the interesting part of Coral and Evelyn on fresh meat is there's such a wide difference, and got wider and wider by the challenge of the daily challenges and eliminations versus the final. And Kenny and Laurel, obviously don't win this season. They do pretty well in the final, but the bigger, stronger people struggle a little more to go up a mountain at high altitude and whatnot. And so a Jordan and Sarah, if I was, wanting to pick what's the best male female pair to run a final, I'm picking them over Laurel and Kenny for sure. But as far as just putting them on a season, I think Laurel and Kenny is about as good as it's ever got from they're going to just win all the daily they're going to make the final. Basically, they're guaranteed to make the final because they're going to win and have power so much. Or who's going to beat them in what elimination are you going to beat these two people in? Whereas I feel Sarah and Jordan, there's at least they almost lost an elimination or two on that season. I could see them winning or losing one. They're not going to just win every daily challenge, but from a final perspective, there's probably been better teams than this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would probably then lean towards Kenny and Laurel then.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly just Laurel too. Again, I want to make sure we're as clear as possible. As much as the whole season is Wes versus Kenny, and so we use his name here, but Laurel is the big part of this. And
the X factor, yeah.
The real, we'll just get, it leads us right to the next thing actually is Darrell and Cara Maria are a pair on this, which is crazy to look back and think that Darrell and Cara Maria were partners and were the first out on the season. They were partners because even if this is 2 or 3 seasons later, a year or two later, this team is just so good, so dominant, but it's Cara Maria's first time. She hasn't gotten the fitness bug quite yet. She's still plenty fit and just regular person, athletic or whatever on this season, but doesn't quite have it yet. And they end up out first. And two-part question here. How shocking is this? Does it get more shocking by the year to look back and be holy cow, how did that happen? And Darrell does pick Cara Maria first. And as a big NFL guy, and I'm sure very invested in, the draft process, and we mentioned the draft and combine earlier, I know it's easy to say in retrospect because we know what Laurel is capable of and everything. And I don't know if standing there in that grass, if it would be that obvious, but it feels like it would have been obvious to be like, well, that chick is twice as big as everyone else. And she seems to be pretty fit, not just like she's way taller or whatever. Like she seems pretty fit. She's twice as big as everyone. Did Darrell make a massive mistake, regardless of the combine results, in picking Cara Maria over Laurel?
Hindsight's 2020, but I think like just from the combine numbers, Cara Maria actually put up like pretty good combine numbers. I think she had the most, well, she had the most pull-ups for the girls. I know that. Like she had pretty good statistics. And I think like from Darrell's standpoint and why he was picking her, he probably was basing it off of, his first fresh meet. He probably wants a partner who's maybe smaller in stature and can maybe like who in his mind might be able to run with their own weight for longer. Maybe he thought, Laurel might be good in more areas geared towards like eliminations or daily challenges, but once the final comes, who knows like how, she's going to hold up potentially. So,
yeah,
I mean, if you could go back in time, if we were doing like a redraft right now, like you and I would probably put Laurel off the board first for Darrell, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's a big what if moment because Darrell, obviously coming into this season, he's 4 out of 5 winning. The only one he hasn't is the season before this where he punches Brad, knocks him out. Could have easily been 5 for 5. And the knock on Darrell, legacy wise or best player of all time wise is like, yeah, you won 4 out of 4 on, those team seasons and stuff. And then you did come back and do enough individual and partner seasons where, you've moved yourself down the list a little bit. You won the one partner with Aviv, but if he picks Laurel here, I mean, they win. There's no chance. And whoever picks Laurel is getting to the final. It's obviously clearly not a guaranteed win because they don't win the final, but you're getting to the final if you pick Laurel. No one's beating you in this style Exile. Maybe, I guess, because Laurel only ever had to go into the Wait For Me Exile, which really benefits someone like herself with the strength and everything. If it was the other one and it was a little more just like running with weight versus like, can you physically carry this weight? Maybe she could lose Exile, but probably not. So Darrell easily could have been, 2-time fresh meat champion.
And who would you say Kenny would have picked? He would have had the 3rd overall pick, I believe, right? Because it went Cara and then Jen took Noor. And then I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I got the list here. So Darrell went first. He picked Cara. Jen went second. And then Kenny went and took Laurel. I don't know if Kenny picks Cara Maria.
I think he might pick Teresa.
I think he picks Teresa, both because I think if Kenny wouldn't have had a clear, like, she looks like she's going to dominate, I think he would have went for who do I think is hot, which, no shade. Paula, immediately after him, goes for literally asked Jeff, do you have a girlfriend before picking him? But on those combine numbers you mentioned, they do say during it, I think it's even Laurel maybe that says in like the little montage that Cara Maria is the best female coming out of the combine. She does 6 pull-ups to Laurel's 2, but they run the same 40 time and Laurel does the obstacle course and half the time Cara does. But I know there's also more than the 4 things that we have data for. So either way, yeah, it was a smart pick. I like what you said about, Darrell trying to think of like, who's the most Aviv like person up there for me that kind of matches what I had before. That makes total sense. The next thing then competitively is Wes. Obviously he's coming into the season. He's won the duel before an individual season. He's done very well on all of his seasons, on the original fresh meet, he goes 5-0 in Exiles. He wins multiple eliminations the season prior to this on the Ruins. He's established himself as a very, very good competitor in this game. But he totally loses it on this is the first season where it's like there's a couple season run where it's like Wes doesn't have it anymore. And in this season, it's 2 things at once. One, him and Mandy can't come close to winning a daily challenge, which, all season long, he, does what he done on Fresh Meat 1. He kind of blames, I'm never going to win because of my partner, which no one else really does that on this season. Everyone's kind of like, other than Laurel and Kenny, every partnership is kind of like there's one good player and one not as good a player. And like, the Landon and Carly's can pull one out. Jen and Noor can pull one out. Him and Mandy never can. But then we get definitive proof, I don't know what your spirituality is, Mike, but I don't know what anyone listening might be, what your faith, anything like that might be. But one thing that we can know for sure, because we have actual evidence in this season, is that whatever you believe in, whatever higher powers, we can all know that karma is real. And if you don't think karma is real, then you haven't watched this season, because Wes ends up in an exile, and in a complete 180 from Fresh Meat 1, Wes ends up hands on his knees getting yelled at by his partner, who he's dogged all season long and thought was the reason weighing him down. Mandy is out there literally saying, I haven't even broken a sweat yet, Wes. What the hell? And they lose their exile to Luke and Ev purely because Wes is the slowest of those four people by a lot. And does this definitively prove that karma is real? And how deserved did this feel to see in this moment, even the most staunch Wes fans, which I was at the time and still am, of like, yeah, this feels right. This feels like this kind of needed to happen.
It was a cinematic masterpiece. I'll say that. That was one thing this season had, was a lot of like, either foreshadows or just, moments that kind of were poetic, I'd say, especially the ending. And yeah, this probably proves that at least in some regard, there is some type of power somewhere.
All of us that always like to reference the challenge gods, which were, always just saying producers. And I know I've got a few specific people listening right now who have let me know in the past they hate hearing it. It's like, scratching the chalkboard when they hear the phrase challenge gods. But in this instance, this was one of few instances where actual challenge gods, not producers, just, the whoever is up there looking over the challenge had in mind that we have to have the payoff. We have to have the poetic justice. And to Mandy's credit, Mandy does. There is the really fun moment during the draft where Wes asks, I believe it's Sydney, he asks, like, hey, how are you on running? And she just straight up says, it's not my favorite thing, but like, I'll do it. And Mandy gives the little point to herself, and Wes is immediately like, all right, I'll take her. And TJ then references it. TJ has a great season. This time, his commentary when they're leaving the Exiles is very spot on with a lot of these groups. But that one is great, where he's like, Mandy, you said you could run. You backed it up. I don't know what happened to your partner. And it's just like, yes, I don't know what happened to Wes either. 2 seasons later, we would get the Wes getting carried up a mountain by Wes's partner as the challenge documentary, which is legally, I don't think, allowed to say Kenny's name. Has to say Wes's partner carries him up the mountain. But this is the beginning of a kind of few season run. Obviously Rivals 2 then would erase all of it, but for a season or two, it's like everything Wes was putting out there comes back to him, which seems a little unfair that he's the only one this happens to, because the other part of this is like, it's a really nice moment after these 2 or 3 seasons in a row where the gender politics of the house have been really nasty and gross, that we're like, finally one of the guys who is, given his female partner shit in the past is like having the role reversed. But it's like, if that was going to pay off on anyone, he's on the list of people that deserve some of that to happen to, but he's a lot further down it than some other people, even on this season with him, that could have had a moment where like, you deserve to look like an ass, like once and for all here. So that's Wes though, but thankfully, it wouldn't stop him from continuing his great challenge career. The biggest what if of the season, there's a couple of them, but one of them for me is Paula. And, this season dominated so much by Wes, Evelyn, Kenny, Laurel, that we're not going to talk as much extensively about a lot of the other people. But one I want to take a moment to shout out is Paula, because Paula on this season, it goes kind of under the radar. She kind of has this reputation as like the one who could never win. And then she finally wins 2 of them. But everyone, likes to say, well, she won when she got Evelyn and Emily Schramm as partners. Like, of course. And I don't think she's appreciated as enough for like, Paula was amazing at this show. Like, she was really good, like a really good competitor. And it just didn't work out for one reason or the other until those moments. But this is one of those seasons where I think if the women all just had to run this final, just the women run it solo as an individual final, I think Paula would have won. Paula does better than Evelyn in the Exile, but she's let down by her partner, Jeff. We will talk about possibly the quote of the season in a moment that she has during that Exile with Jeff, of like just tearing him a new one. But Paula has it this season. She's an incredible competitor this season. She performs equal to Evelyn in all of the dailies and in the Exile, if not better. Do you think, because you mentioned earlier, Jeff's, combine numbers were really, really great, really strong. And in fact, I'm kind of shocked by them. If I pull them back up here, Jeff in the combine, he had 19 pull-ups, which is only second to Noor. And then he had the highest vertical jump. He was in the middle of the pack on the 40-yard dash and then kind of in the middle of the pack on the obstacle course. So it was really just the pull-ups, which I guess if you were training, she says he was trained for the Navy SEALs or something at some point. Maybe that explains why he's got some pull-ups in him. But if Paula picks Pete, does Paula win this season?
That's a good question. I think
the draft order was, it was like all guys first and then all
Noor would still be I still think Noor would be the first guy off my board.
Yeah, well, that was the right pick.
Yeah, in a redraft, I would say Pete would go to Paula, and we could be having an entirely different discussion right now.
Yeah, and I just, again, hindsight's 2020. You know, she looks at the numbers, she sees, you know, historically she's also worked with, you know, the Kennys of the world, like the bigger, taller guys, and Jeff is, you know, a lot taller than all the others. But it's another one of those where I can't put myself in the moment without, you know, all this hindsight of all these years later. But like, Pete's a 21-year-old college guy that is like clearly athletic, and, you know, kind of like, you look at him and you're like, yeah, you're like a sporty bro. Like, it, you know, it's like fine to just kind of stereotype. And I would have been, if I was Paul, a stereotype, be like, yeah, I want that guy. He's young. He'll listen to whatever I say probably. And he looks to be like the youngest athlete of all these guys. And even if it's not Pete, Brandon, even I might have in the moment been like over Jeff, and even that maybe works out way differently. But it just bums me out that
losing Paula that early in the season hurt, kind of.
Yeah, and it, you know, it helps pay off all, you know, the roller coaster we talked about before of, you know, Kenny losing a couple people in a row, Sarah, Paula, and then it all coming back, and maybe that changes and isn't as dramatic or interesting if Paula's there the whole time. But as a big Paula fan, as a Key West and Austin are kind of my two real world seasons that were like the right age for me to like, those were my people. I, no matter what, was always pulling for all of them. It just tears me up that Paula doesn't always get the respect she deserves as one of like the best to ever play this game, and no one else really puts her in that kind of top tier category, and I do. And this was one of the seasons where, with one different draft pick, I think she could have at least been there in the final, if not like her and Pete in the final. Probably lose to Landon and Carly still, but I don't know. I think they would have had a chance. Because we haven't mentioned a lot of the other people, a couple just real quick rapid fire through a few of the other members. Ryan and Jen, as you said earlier, you know, play the middle really well. In all the seasons they're on, they're kind of always, they're just great glue guys, basically, in a challenge house. They're kind of friends with everyone. They take the game serious, but they would prefer to like have good friendships first and then like compete in the game second. But I think for both of those two, Ryan and Jen both, this is definitely their best season competitively, not just from like the political decisions they make, but like Ryan performs really well, Jen performs really well. I don't feel like there's any other seasons where I would say either of them did better in any facet of the game.
Yeah, I'm with you on that regard. I think like you can make an argument that Jen kind of impressed me in the final of Cutthroat the following season, but as a whole basis, I would say this is probably Jen's best season from like, you could kind of argue like an entire standpoint. I mean, she played a pretty good social game on Rivals, seeing as how like her and Mandy never had to see an elimination despite not being like, you know, a top 3 team on that season. But yeah, from a whole general basis, same thing with Ryan. He was kind of just like a background like character on like his other seasons that like he was on, such as like the Duel and such, Duel 2 rather, and the Gauntlet 3. I think like, yeah, this would probably rank as like their best seasons. Like if you were to ask like, oh, what's like the Ryan season you'll think of when you think of him, and it would probably be Fresh Meat too. What's the Jen season? Probably be this. So it allowed a lot of secondary people to shine, and I think that's why I like the cast decision so much on this season.
Yeah, because it is, while it's that one storyline, that one, you know, alliance versus each other, that storyline is made interesting, not just because of what Wes and Kenny and Evelyn are doing each episode, but because it's for 2 episodes in a row. It's like, all right, Ryan has decided to make this decision, and he's the one pulling the strings and tricking and going along and like is at center of this storyline and rivalry. And then Jen for an episode and a half is like at the center of that story. And it just works out so well that, it's one story the whole time, but the people come in and out of like who are the factors within the story, and everyone kind of has a part in it. The another person to mention, and definitely the biggest disappointment of the entire season, the kind of biggest bonehead moment of the whole season, CJ and Sydney. CJ, who I adore, I love, is one of the people that I was like, you were built for the challenge, right? At the time, you could have been on more seasons of the challenge, and it's a shame you weren't. He obviously has the, incredible hall brawl moment for Zach a couple seasons from now and Battle of the Seasons. But CJ and Sydney, for all the potential they have this season, it takes them 90 minutes to do a 7-piece tangram puzzle. 90 minutes to do a 7-piece puzzle. It's like what 0 to 10. This is a easy 10 out of 10 on the embarrassing scale, right? Like this is just such a blown opportunity.
To their defense, when I interviewed CJ, he said that they threw that elimination.
I actually remember listening to this now. Yeah, but can't you throw it without making yourself look like that? Like that dumb? Like, can't you just make sure you never pass someone? Because they rightfully get roasted by TJ at the end of that. And did he say why? Was it just like they wanted to leave for any reason, or like
I think
he
it's
wanted
just
Landon
simply for the fact that like he realized like after being thrown in like that his days were kind of numbered. Like when it came to like the game, because Wes had like turned on him and such, and he like liked Landon, so he decided like they deserve to come back. So he was like, you know what, we'll just throw this thing to you, and you have a better shot in this game than I do.
Well, that makes it it makes it better, because it truly, if you're trying, there's just no way that puzzle, no matter what, the worst case scenario for that puzzle should be like 8 minutes. It just, there's only so many combinations. It's only 7 pieces. Some of them are big. They only fit one spot. I feel like they could have maybe put up a slightly better effort in their fake defeat, but it makes me feel better that was not their best effort. Then we've got 2 other people to quick shout outs on the fresh meat side. Luke's actually pretty solid, right? Because he kind of it's not really even a bad edit. It's just a bad portrayal by his partner, Evelyn, at times. But Luke was actually pretty solid. I feel like it was kind of a surprise we never saw him again.
He's got a 3-1.
Or no, we do see him one more time. He's on Cutthroat.
Yeah. He's got a 3-1 elimination record with a 2nd place in a final appearance. So the statistics would suggest that he's he's got a 75% win percentage when it comes to eliminations. So,
because is he the one that him and Easy do the
fly
swatter?
Yeah.
Well, the challenge, inventing knob top right before our eyes, way back on Cutthroat. And
then
he
performed in the final of Cutthroat too. Like this guy was solid. Like his combine numbers were pretty decent too, I believe, if I remember. Mm-hmm. I think like for his particular skill set, the exiles that like they did maybe didn't benefit him because he's a bit of a smaller guy in stature. So I guess carrying weight is not necessarily something that gears towards his strengths. But I think if you would have put him in like a traditional final where you just have to like run with no weight, I think you might see him surprise some people.
For sure. And he does really great in the 2 exiles this season. 1, you carry the backpack. 1, you carry the like weight rack with the buckets and whatnot. And he struggles much more in the weight rack one, again, because the size matters. Like we said about Laurel earlier, it's like the bigger, stronger you are. This one, that's tailored to, unlike most endurance things. The other one was much more traditional endurance. Yes, you have to carry weight, but in a less awkward fashion and whatnot. And yeah, I think it's mostly just his attitude all season, is what rubs Ev the wrong way, because Luke, I guess, is just too nice of a guy, too happy and joyful of a person for that period of Evelyn's life to be around. He does make, the only time he deserves Evelyn's kind of ire is when he announces loudly on the bus the one afternoon or after the daily, like, I was cramping up really bad. If we had to go into an exile right now, like, I don't think that'd be a good thing for us. And like, she has every reason to be like, Luke, maybe you don't just say that out loud while we're all sitting on the bus together. Maybe you save that for when we get back to the house and like one-on-one conversation. The final one to touch on then, before we get to our champions of the season, is Noor, who is an absolute beast. And have you spoken to him by chance? I know he's done a podcast or 2.
Yeah,
What was there? Did he not want to come back, or was he not called back?
he wasn't even called again.
Just
Not
makes
even.
no sense.
You would have thought at least like for Cutthroat, because it seemed like they were kind of like picking those fresh meat two people to kind of do another season. You would have think like he would have at least gotten another availability call at the minimum. I just think that they were bored with him.
Yeah, and I get that he, of all the fresh meat, because of being partnered with Jen, who was pushing this more than anyone else, was like, yeah, the alumni, like, I'm just here to like compete alongside of my alumni. She does everything. She does all the talking. Like, I'm just hanging out. And that, kind of ruins his chances at being in storylines. But he'll be popping up in our best quote award later on. Like, he gives good confessionals. He's an awesome competitor, and like it feels like he does have the personality and everything. He just kind of chose not to show it as much this season, or like be in the background, and that ultimately definitely kind of hurt him. As the great Dan Setzler has recently said on my podcast and others and things before, if you're not fucking or fighting, you're not getting calls back, and
Yeah.
Nor wasn't doing either of those. But he was a beast, and I thought he was just really fun, and there was a lot of personality there, and it's really bums me out that he never got a call back, especially how well he ended up doing, even against the odds of his asthma flaring up at the end when it's getting super cold out and everything, and still kicking butt for the most part in the last daily and Exile and elimination. But that brings us to the two stars of the eventual stars and winners of the season that we've barely mentioned so far, and that's Landon and Carly. Landon and Carly get the win. We did talk about Landon playing politics for the first time. He did a very good job with that. We stopped short of talking about, it's not just that he teams up and is willing to play at the beginning, but he also flips sides at the exact right time in the middle, and is the one who is willing to put Wes and Ev in versus each other, even knowing like it's not like this is going to save me from ever going in again, but I don't have that option anymore. He flips sides. So any final thoughts on Landon's political game that we didn't say earlier on?
No, I just think that he ultimately made the right moves at the right times. Like he got on Wes's train like when it was time to get on, like while it still held some weight, and then he hopped off at the right time when the numbers had dwindled down, and you realized like, okay, this guy's kind of ran its course at this moment. So he made the right moves at the right times.
For sure. And then, so we mentioned before, Landon, maybe if he wins Duel 2, we could really have is he the best of all time argument. He's up there for me of like, if you could just need one person to win one season and you could pick, any version of any person ever, I'd be hard pressed not to pick Landon around this time, Duel 2, Fresh Meat 2. But we're not going to try to answer where he ranks all time, just pure player wise. But the one we are going to ask, he is undoubtedly the greatest partner of all time, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not even close.
Not even a question.
It's just I've given this on a couple different podcasts before, given this opinion of this season. There's a nuanced way to look at this season here and them winning together, because Carly, she's the last pick, the last female pick of the draft. So they're partners by default. She is viewed as kind of the underdog early on, all the way through until they end up winning at the end. There's obviously the huge Exile win that we'll talk about in a moment. But a lot of people look at this very kind of like through a binary lens of like, wow, I can't believe Landon won with Carly as his partner. And that's, like completely unfair to her. And then others, especially she's done a bunch of the interviews before and is such a cool, wonderful person and everything, that then it goes the other way of like, no. Like, why are you not giving Carly her flowers? Like, Carly deserves all the credit for this. Like, Landon and Carly won together. And I'm one who's like, parts of both of that are true and matter to like magnify how great what both of them did was, because in the Exile specifically, yes, Carly is quite literally on the verge of consciousness for like 30 straight minutes, which is wild for anyone to push themselves to that limit and then keep going. No one does that. No one can do that. It's so unbelievably hard. And that is the part that I think she needs to get her credit for. Like, that's a mental toughness that few in sports have, like that's what makes great athletes is that they're willing to push themselves that hard continuously over and over. But in the Landon being the greatest partner of all time, there is not a man or woman in the history of the challenge house specifically that ever could have won this season with Carly as their partner, because no one else in that moment could have handled their partner being on the verge of consciousness the way, with the patience and the motivation and the like knowledge and understanding of the situation that Landon does. Anyone else you put her with in that moment, is just getting pissed off, is just yelling, is pushing too hard. And then suddenly Carly's not on the verge of consciousness. She's passed out and is actually like, nope, done. Can't do it any further. And Landon has the patience and the wherewithal to be like, okay, my partner's eyes are rolling into the back of her head. What do I do here? Well, we're in first. So like we can slow down. We can stand still until if they catch up, that's a different story. Hey, sit down, drink water. He like holds her by the face multiple different times and is like, look at me. No, I need you to just focus on me for like 10 seconds. Prove you could focus on something for 10 seconds. And I think it's a tough argument to have without either being like, while trying to thread the needle that I'm trying to thread here of like, this is the most impressive thing I've ever maybe seen in challenge history, is Landon pulling this win out of his and Carly's season, while also not like saying Carly was some horrible competitor by any means, because she was awesome. And again, pushing herself to that limit is so incredible. But is there any single one else you could think of? We'll just keep it to the guys, because it would be a guy partnered with her that could have won this season, or could have won even that Exile with Carly in that situation, other than Landon.
Besides maybe Dunbar, I don't think any. Just kidding.
Are you a big Dunbar guy?
No.
That's a yes. There's a lot. There's more of you out there than you think.
Yeah, no, all jokes aside, no, I genuinely believe he's the only guy.
Yeah, it's just, and then the final, is its own thing, literally putting his head in her butt and pushing her up the last, the last hill and everything. Is this, I once on the Challenge Fandom podcast joined them to try to break down and name the greatest single season performance ever, like the most dominant performance ever in the history of the show. Anyone that won, or even people that didn't win, maybe that were that dominant, like Laurel and Kenny actually got mentioned in that conversation. And I came down to Jordan on War of the Worlds 2 and Landon on this season as the ones that I thought were, the greatest single season ever played, or most dominant single season ever played. I kind of landed on this one as like the most impressed I've ever been with. Like, I can't believe after all that you guys won. Would you feel similar? Is there any others that pop up immediately to your mind that you think are like on the same level as this win for Landon and Carly?
No, I agree with you on that regard. I think if you just want to point out a single like elimination, or not elimination, like a single final win, you can make an argument that Jordan's actually 30-30 win after the plane.
If you're just talking the final itself, he won
just
an incredibly hard 30 on a torn ACL.
However, I think, but if you factor in the fact that Landon not only won, but like had to rely on like another like individual, like to like had to carry that person with him in order to win, is a lot more impressive. Like if Landon hypothetically fell out of a helicopter and won, like, oh, that's impressive, but like he only had to win for himself. He had to carry another like grown human along with him, otherwise he couldn't win, so that's why I think Fresh Meat 2's win is just performance as a whole is my most impressive.
Yeah, and he in the final, the kind of icing on the cake of like how good at every single thing they're asked to do Landon is, and how just kind of athletically much better he is than everyone else at this like era of the show, is they win the final almost entirely because of the long segment where they have to carry the 80-pound rucksack and all the other teams struggle mightily to carry it, and Landon just casually throws it on his shoulder. I'm sure not casually, I'm sure it sucked, but has no problem just being like, I'm throwing this on the shoulder of court, like, Carly, you're never going to be asked to carry this, don't worry. And like, no problem at all. That separates them in a huge way. The biking portion where almost all of the duos end up walking the bikes, but immediately Landon just says, Carly, like, we're both getting off. I am going to push both bikes, one in one hand, one in the other. You're going to stand behind me and hold on to my back, and I'm going to literally pull you to give you some of my energy. And the whole way up that section is him pushing both bikes, pulling his partner literally, and still going faster than everyone else. And then, of course, we mentioned before him literally as they climb the final mountain being like, I'm going to get behind you and I'm going to put my head in your ass and I am going to push. So every time I take a step, I'm going to push you up with my head. You're going to have to take a step. He's just on a level of his own. And it's why, even though he only did 4 seasons and he didn't quite win all 4 of them and only did 3 of them, when you do talk the best ever, you gotta, it's why him and Jordan are the 2 with less of a, not as bulky of a resume as the CT and Bananas of the world get mentioned, because you can just tell they have moments like this season where it's just like they're clearly athletically just on a different level than everyone else around them at that time. So with that, let's move from storylines to awards, and let's hand out some hardware. And we've got a bunch of awards. How we do this every time, Mike, is I split the challenge. When I think about the challenge, I always talk about there's a show side and a sports side. There's 2 pillars to the show itself. And so my awards are split in half as well. We got 3 awards for the sports side, 3 awards for the show side. We'll start with the sports side. The best daily challenge, the best Exile, and normally elimination, but Exile in this one, in the best athletic performance. Starting with the best daily challenge, before we list the nominees, any overall thoughts on just this collection of daily challenges in general? Love, hate, somewhere in the middle?
I like them. They were pretty unique. You had some of them, like the one where they had to push against the log was innovative. You had another one, I believe, where the male partner had to jump onto looked like a boxing bag or something of that nature, right? And then, oh, can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, all right, you're back now. It was a little choppy for a second.
Yeah, the daily challenge where they had to, looked like it was the male partner jumped onto like a boxing bag of sorts.
Yes, had to climb the ladder up, or 2 different ladders up, and then jump on. Was not the invention, they'd had people falling before, but a couple early contenders for worst falls in challenge history between Carly and Evelyn on that daily challenge. Took some really, really, really hard falls. Yeah, I think I kind of always, I'm biased towards, I like partner seasons the best in general versus individual or team seasons. But I also, part of that is I like the partner challenges they come up with usually are like my favorite kind of challenges come out of being able to build a partner one. There's 4 this season. I think overall in the season, they're pretty good. They're above average. It's not like the greatest set of challenges we've ever had, but there's no real duds. And I definitely, there's some seasons where you're like, I kind of didn't like any of the stuff they were doing. So I think this one's definitely at least above average. The 4 that I'm going to say are the nominees for the best of the season that I'll run through here. And then we can each take our pick at which one we think was the best overall of the season. And if I don't mention one you think should have been on there, you can voice your opinion for that. Chronologically, episode 1, Dirty Mouth, which is when they have to blindfold, wrestle for the yoga balls in the mud pit, a classic, challenge staple. This was the 2nd or 3rd time they had done a variation of this challenge, and it would ultimately become one that happens. Usually the first episode of a lot of seasons is the wrestling for the balls in the mud pit. We're about to actually get that as the first daily challenge on season 38, if the trailer is indicative of when that is going to happen. But Laurel and Kenny assert their dominance early on. It's funny because the blindfolded aspect of it makes it very fun and funny. Everything about that's really good. Episode 2, I'll Be There For You, is where they have to, one at a time, dive down 15 feet, pick up a car battery off the base of the lake or whatever that they're in, lift it up, and then take turns switching places and holding their breath and holding it up for as long as they can. Carly and Landy get the win. They do a final round versus Kenny and Laurel, who come up with the strategy of pulling the weight up to the top of the water and just keeping their head underneath a little bit. It's really scary. And if I had to do that, I would be so freaked out. All the holding the breath stuff they used to do was always pretty intimidating for me, but I thought this was inventive and interesting and cool and plays out really well. It's competitive, and it's the first time Landon and Carly kind of assert everyone Danny in the background says she's a wild card like 5 times in a row about Carly in this moment, which I can never get out of my head, of just him to anyone that'll listen, like, man, what a wild card. She's a wild card, right? Carly, wow, what a wild card. And I just almost like, dude, shut up. Just please stop talking and stop coming on the show. So that one, third nominee, Turnstile, you referenced, where they start in teams of 4. They get to team up before it and actually have another little draft, which works out flawlessly, as the draft always does in the world of the challenge, and push against each other to turn the log around. Very reminiscent of the duel 1 elimination, where it was a 1-on-1. This is eventually a 2-on-2 version or a 4-on-4 version. It has the big moment of Evelyn, throwing her round to let CJ and Wes just get a win, because right before, Pete and Kenny and Laurel and Jill go for over an hour and just totally wreck their bodies. And so Evelyn's like, dude, Wes, CJ, you guys could beat these guys if they have to go immediately again. They do not. That is ultimately then leads to the downfall that we talked about of Wes and Ev after that, sacrificing themselves to save their ass one final time, but ultimately ruining everything. So very consequential daily challenge. And then the fourth and final nominee, Wrecking Ball, where one partner gets strung up by their feet. The other partner swings them around and has to keep them from swinging through the middle of the little field they're in while they build a puzzle. And they have to keep pushing their partner away to build the puzzle in the middle, which leads to a lot of comedy, a lot of women crashing into puzzles when their male partners have no chance at swinging them around or keeping them away. So of those 4, or a different one, if you think there's a different one, which one would you say was the best of the season, both in the game itself, how it what shook out, whether it was competitive, all things considered? What's your favorite or best of the season?
I would have picked the Turnstile one, because I thought it was like really dramatic, both from like a standpoint of like, you had to finally get to see Kenny and Wes kind of like go up against each other, so to speak, like in a physical aspect. And also from a standpoint of the numbers playing a part, because they let Jill and Pete win because they knew like, okay, we're not going to really be on the chopping block. And plus we get to prove our allegiance to somebody. That way we got a firm number in our hand. So I would probably choose that one.
I'm with you. I think I'm really biased towards the holding your breath stuff, because I just think it's really interesting, and like they're most creative. They're at their kind of most creative when they come up with stuff like this. And also just being such a big Landon and Carly fan that like they win that one. So I was leaning a little there, but I think Turnstile is the answer, both because it's a really good game. We get a lot of performances that are indicative of this whole season, between Landon after the initial, like the 1 hour long one, where it's Landon and Carly teamed up with Ryan and Teresa versus Jill and Pete, Kenny and Laurel. They're at a standstill for over an hour. It's Ryan's best performance, where he like goes mano a mano with, I believe, Pete for like an hour and is like holding his ground, if not winning. They almost win. And then when they switch to after an hour, they go boys only, and Pete and Kenny pulled off, but Landon's literally dead afterwards. Like he falls over and like he like can't move. Like he's, completely and totally taxed and out of it. So you get all of that. You get Wes losing not straight up to Kenny, because when they do that matchup, then it's Wes is on the opposite side of Pete, and it's Pete that completely destroys Wes and like pushes his thing all the way around and like wins that round for them. But it does feel like, Kenny's side versus Wes's side, straight up mano a mano, and just a physical who could push the other one. And, the side that wins is indicative of the season. And then, like you said, them letting Pete and Jill win for the political ramifications that came of that. All in all, this daily challenge brings everything to the table and does everything you'd want a daily to do for that episode in the season. So Turnstile it is. That's the winner. As for Best Exile, normally this award's a little more fun because we got all these eliminations to pick from. This season, Exiles are all, there's 2 versions of it, but they're essentially the same thing. It's a 6-mile run. The one up the hill is a little shorter. The other one's 6 miles, puzzles in between. You're carrying weight during it. You finish the puzzle. You get a little advantage, drop some weight, whatnot. Quickly, before we name the best one, your feelings on having a season with Exiles versus the normal elimination setup?
It's unique, but I think it's mostly unique in the aspect that like the other teams don't get to watch or see know who's coming back. That part I like, but I actually would have preferred like a normal elimination setup, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's one of their best decisions ever that they nailed it, that they did this twice for Fresh Meat and Fresh Meat 2, and that's it, because it's really cool and interesting and it works and it pans out in this, season. A lot of Exiles are really like riveting, and the reveal afterwards back at the house is like interesting, and the way they edit the back and forth with that is great. But I definitely, if this would have became the norm or something, that would have been horrible. So I think they nailed it of like, we did this, it was cool and creative, but like, we're not going to press our luck. We're just only going to have done it the twice. We're going to get back to the regular eliminations. Cause if I had to pick one or the other, of course I'm picking regular eliminations over the Exiles, but it is cool and interesting. And it's also nice that it's like, gives you evidence of like, who's going to win this final. Cause they're, they are a version of finals every single time, which is wild that they are as long as they are. As for the best of the season, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think, as much as a bunch of them were very competitive and very consequential of who beat who, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that we don't even have to have other nominees other than Landon and Carly beating Evan Luke in the blackout version, which the safety standards on the challenge had slowly but surely gotten to a decent place by this season, but that course that they do the Wait For Me one on, that path is not very wide, and there's like no barrier on the one side of it, and it's just like a drop. And for them to be stumbling and carrying all that weight, I was terrified when they did this during the day. I think it was Luke, the first time Luke's in one, it like literally like stumbles with this thing one time, and I'm like, dude, you're about to fall off the fucking cliff. Like, what is going on here? When they then had to do this at night in the pitch black, I was very scared someone was going to get hurt. But is there any other Exile you would put up anywhere near Landon and Carly versus Evan Luke?
No, you nailed it. That's got to be, I think that's the only answer that you could possibly give there.
It's just too much of a, it's one of the moments you think of from this season, which we'll talk about it again in a moment when we get to that award. But yeah, shout Paula versus Evelyn is obviously great. That's close. That has ramifications into the future. Wes versus Evelyn is interesting just because they end up there, but there's just nothing that really touches that one. So Landon and Carly, you get another win to add to the resume, the best Exile of the season. Then a best athletic performance of the season. This one a little bit harder than most seasons. This is pretty easy award to give out. This isn't the best win. It's like when someone, gets to really show off their athletic abilities the most. For instance, like Landon has won this award, but previously for the season, I think it was Inferno 2 or whatever his rookie season was, where he had to go head to
Inferno 2,
yeah, he had to go head to head with CT climbing the rope like up into the sky, and he got like twice as far as anyone else, and it was literally like one-on-one to win the thing. So like that type of moment is what we're looking for here. In this season, a lot of those come in eliminations sometimes or in individual dailies. So this season had, a lot less of that. My 4 nominees that I put up is first Noor for his combine, because again, I said it before, but just to reiterate, he literally had the best numbers in 3 of the 4 things that they had to do, and he was second in the other one, which was the vertical leap, which, being a shorter person, yes, is both a help and a hurts you in that style thing, but way more pull-ups, way faster. A 4.84 40-yard dash for just a regular person in street clothes being told to just sprint on command, that's pretty damn fast, and the fastest obstacle course side. So while we didn't get to see a ton of it other than the one photo highlight of him running the 40, Noor's combine definitely stands out as like he was the clear, obvious number 1 pick. Laurel in Dirty Mouth is dominant and is like a great first daily for her to just announce herself as like, she ends that one she stumbles upon, I think it's Carly that's holding the last ball in the last round and just rips it from her. And Darrell has a great quote about it that they actually put in the challenge documentary last week. That moment of the end of that makes the documentary. Pete in episode 6, because on Turnstile, which we just talked about, he's the real reason they win both of the 2 rounds that they win, not Kenny or Laurel. A big part Laurel, but both of them come down to just the guys. They tell the girls to leave. And so Pete in that one, definitely. And then the 4th nominee isn't a specific one. It just feels right. Laurel and Kenny, kind of like by default of the collection of their their performances overall, I felt hard pressed to not at least nominate them for the best athletic performance of the season, even if there isn't one specific thing that stands out over all of them. Am I missing any? And if not, what would be your pick out of this?
No, I think you got all the right picks, but I think for who I'm going to give it to, I'll use this analogy because in the NFL, when they hand out the MVP awards at the end of the season, it's usually not to whoever ends up like winning in the playoffs or the Super Bowl. It's usually based on like the regular season performance. So by that metric, I would probably have to give it to Kenny and Laurel, I think.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And, maybe I think I'll go ahead and just say both of them, but if there's only one award to actually give one trophy, we'll go to Laurel for Dirty Mouth specifically, if we have to put a specific on it. But yeah, those two between the rest of the whole season, it's just not even close most of the time. And it's, as you referenced earlier in the pod, it's not just that they win everyone, it's that they have to win everyone. They know going in, like, we have to win. And yes, they do get to go last, which this is one of many seasons where picking the order matters and they get to watch and assess. But regardless, it's just unbelievable. Then we move to the 3 awards, or with 4, I guess, awards in the end on the show side of things, starting with Best Quote, which I will read the nominees aloud to you here, Mike. The listeners will thankfully not hear my sad version of it. I will overlay the actual better versions of it, but you're going to have to stick for just actually hearing me say them out loud, because the audio on the Zoom, I've tried in the past playing the clips for my guests and whatnot, and the audio just doesn't always track on that. So I've got 5 nominees here, and I have a strong contender of who I think should win in chronological order. We've got Sandy in the first episode, who, in referencing the amount of money they are playing for, she mentions that if she were to win, she would be spending them on...
Like, I'm not even a full A cup, so if I get this money, yeah, I'm definitely throwing some D's on this bitch.
She ultimately doesn't get that money, but she would not have been the first or the last challenge competitor to use their winnings on such an investment. We've seen that a few times. And then we've got back-to-back nominees from Paula, both in the 3rd episode. The first one, during the vote, that episode is the first time that some of the fresh meat cast members go rogue and they vote opposite what their alumni partner does, and they seemingly don't tell their alumni they're going to do this beforehand. Pete does, Noor does. I think there's one other, and Paula says, quote,
"What the hell?" Noor throws in another random vote, and I'm like, what the hell are these fresh meat doing? They have an opinion of their own? That's so inappropriate.
But it's just a very funny moment of her getting very mad. And then the other one, that episode that I referenced earlier, is in the Exile. She is, begging Jeff to keep running, to keep up with her. And she says, quote,
"Come on, Jeff. You tried out for the Navy SEALs. I'm a girl who played the tuba. I wear headgear, and I have fake boobs. Let's go." Oh, it's so irritating that I have to keep yelling at this 200-and-something pound man to hurry up.
Just rips him apart with this, and comically, but also very seriously, of like, bro, like, come on. How are you not keeping up with me right now? 4th nominee then is Noor. During the Mandy, when Jen, we should just say flat out, punches Mandy in the face. There's no way around this. I have watched the frame by frame as I did that episode just to double check and make sure. Never mentioned again. No even thought. No production coming in. No even thought to kick Jen off the season for punching another woman straight in the face and connecting in the face. But Noor's trying to hold her back, and he says, actually, that is not the one that made the list. I'm talking about a totally separate one. In that moment, he talks about Jen ripping his exoskeleton off, which could have made this list. The one that does make it is when Carly takes the horrible fall in episode 5 on the Daily Challenge. She falls. It's horrible. She comes out making all kinds of crazy noises from the fall. And Noor says, quote,
Carly comes up making the noise of perhaps like a pregnant manatee or a dying whale.
Those are very spot on. It's actually kind of it. I don't know what that would sound like, but I imagine it is the noises that come out of Carly's mouth, which is the 2nd season in a row that we get an aquatic animal noise reference. The season prior, we get MJ falling during the trivia, sounding like a dying seal, as I think it's Rachel Robinson that says about it. So 2 seasons in a row, we get a similar quote. And then the final one is Wes, after being eliminated.
Coming on these challenges are worth it. I'm in an exclusive club, although I feel like most of the members are a lot lower individuals than I am. But that being said, I need rehab for challenges. I need to go to a place and say, hi, I'm Wes, I'm 24 years old, and I'm a challengeaholic.
Of those 5, Mike, I know you only had to imagine them saying them as you heard me, but the listeners heard the real versions. Which one stands out to you? Which one would you give the award to?
I'm giving mine to Paula and Exile with Jeff.
Yes, it's the only nominee, or it's the only one. It's so good. The moment's so perfect. It's indicative of what we said earlier about Paula, this season and her in general being a little underrated. And like that moment is the exact clip from this season of like, she's literally picked the guy who had the best stats of the combine, who said he tried out for the Navy SEALs. And she's out there just yelling at him, desperately pleading, please keep up. I am beating Evelyn right now, and you're losing this for me. Yeah, Paula gets the win. And I will also say it's not listed on the outline I gave you, but I also, during Best Quote, always do the Dan Renzi Award for the Confessional King or Queen of the season. Dan Renzi is around circa Challenge 2000. Or Extreme Challenge? Yeah, Extreme Challenge, excuse me. Which one of the two? Man, I've done too many of these seasons too fast in a row. Do you remember one of those two? Dan Renzi was the original, to me, confessional king of like, just let that man talk in the interview the whole time. We've had lots of kings and queens of the confessional over the years, but the award is named for him. This season, it goes to Paula, even in 3 episodes. Collectively, she's by far the best interview, the best confessional this season. Would you disagree with that at all?
No, I 100% would say Paul is the confessional queen for the season.
All right. And then we come to the biggest awards, the Iconic Moment Award, which with this, Mike, it's not, I don't call it the best moment of the season, because often the kind of iconic, memorable moments aren't always like people's best moments, but it's some mixture of the best moment of the season, the most memorable, the most infamous. The easiest way to think about it is, if I tell you Fresh Meat 2, like we're talking or whatever, and then I just randomly bring up Fresh Meat 2, the first thing your head's going to go to, the first moment that's going to maybe come up to your mind. Or if I know you're a man who likes a bracket, I really enjoyed your best real world season of all time bracket that you did. I guess it's been a while back now. Is that springtime?
That was March, yeah.
Think of this category here as when someone like myself or you that understands brackets much better than the official challenge account, they did what I thought was a horrific greatest challenge moment of all time bracket fairly recently, where I was just appalled at the what they picked to go in or not go in their bracket. So one day I will do a true version of the actual greatest moments in challenge history, most memorable moments, and I will mostly be looking to these lists of nominees of each season as the obvious ones that would make it in there. So with all of that lengthy explanation for what the iconic moment is, it's like an MVP in sports. It takes a little explanation. It's not just a clear-cut thing. I've got 6 nominees. I'll run through them. You tell me if I'm missing any, and if not, which one stands out to you, or which couple maybe stand out to you, which ones you're debating between. First episode, Combine and Draft. We talked at length about it. We don't got to add anything to it. It's fantastic. It works every time, and it's a nice, really good open to the season. Second episode, Evelyn and Carly have a condiment fight. It's mostly a peanut butter fight. It turns into a lot of condiment fights and is in the midst of there's a lot of party and craziness segments in the first couple episodes. That one really stands out. Third episode, Jen versus Mandy, followed immediately by Jen and Wes's contract being revealed. That entire segment, her monologue, her punching Mandy, the contract being revealed, all of it, that moment. Fourth nominee, Brandon partying naked, coming down, doing the shot, holding his junk in his hand, doing the shot, getting in the hot tub naked, followed by the next morning, having the morning beers and ultimately getting disqualified because he drank before the Exile that they were just trying to start and then give up because of Caitlin's injury. That all moment. Fifth nominee, Wes, Evelyn, and Kenny cutting the deal in episode 6 that ultimately screws Wes and Evelyn over, and that kind of heated discussion on the porch. Kenny being like, you guys are going to fuck me over. Why would I ever do this? But then kind of seeing Kenny realize in the moment, if they don't, this is going to work out for me, not them. And then the final moment, episode 8, Carly on the verge of consciousness, that entire exile, her and Landon's win over Luke and Evelyn. Those would be the 6 moments I kind of think of as like the biggest flashbulb moments for top of mind. If I think of this season, am I missing any that you would want to give a shout out to or think belong on this list of nominees?
I would actually throw in the potatoes fight with Danny and Pete. And Brandon as well, yeah.
I forgot about that, yeah. And because Wes gets hurt.
They don't show it. They don't show this, but I want you, once we're done with this, you probably don't or haven't realized this maybe, or you might have and just like brushed it off. I want you to go back and rewatch that like clip from that episode. If you notice, when the fight first starts, Danny has a hat on, and then like when they flash forward, like after the incident takes place, when they're like in each other's face, Danny no longer has the hat on, and he's got like a lump on the side of like his like forehead. It's because they didn't show this, but Pete like slammed Danny's head against the counter, like when he went to go take the potatoes. Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. Did you learn that from one of them or someone else in the house?
Yeah,
from Pete?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that just adds even more to like they clearly didn't care about cast violence this season. For like they didn't say a word about Jen punching Mandy. That's insane.
Yeah.
And that makes more. It helps Danny's case too for being. I mean, it's completely silly that drunken Danny gets himself into that situation. Anyways, Pete maybe not deserve to slam someone's head into a table, but he does just walk up and just bare hand swipe all the food off his plate. And it's just like, dude, that's just not cool. But it makes way more sense why Danny was even more like turned up then and like ready to like, now I'm ready to like fight someone. I don't care who it is. Brandon, great, for no reason. Let's just get in a fight. That makes way more sense. That's wild. I am going to have to go back and watch, because I also always remember that moment for both Wes gets pushed and hits his head and like falls to the fetal position, but then gets up and jumps on Brandon and literally like bear hugs Brandon from the front, and Brandon's just walking around with like a Wes backpack on the front side of him. And yeah, everything. Then Danny apologizing like 1,700 times, and Brandon's very funny confessional of like, well, Danny said sorry. Then he said sorry again. Then he kept saying sorry, and he said sorry again. And eventually I was like, it's okay. We can move on from this. So that deserves to be on the list. I like that. Would that be your pick to win the Iconic Moment Award, or which one are you going with for the
from
winner?
an objective standpoint, like I know that's probably not the most memorable moment. So like if I'm just giving an objective award, I would probably say like the Carly Exile win with Landon.
Yeah, it's hard. This is where this award becomes really hard to do, because if I do use that single question that I, ended my way too long explanation with, of like, if you are someone says Fresh Me Too, what's the first thing you think of? I think of Landon and Carly winning, and I think of, everything we talked about before of, how impressive it was of Landon, how impressive it was of Carly to be on the verge of consciousness. So that comes to mind first. But I think I'm tempted to go with Jen and Mandy's fight. I definitely know that it's making it into like the greatest moments ever bracket, assuming the bracket ends up one day being, like a 64 moment bracket and not like 16 or something. That really stands out to me as just one of the like classic fights in challenge history. And again, the fact that there's no repercussions for punching someone in the face.
I was tempted to pick that one.
And yeah, Jen's monologue is just so perfect in that moment of like, if you don't know, I'm doing my job, baby. And then, the words they exchange are vicious and really mean, but they're at least contained to the moment of like, all right, someone's punched someone. Now we're going to start saying some really horrible, calling each other some really horrible names and everything, which, that feels like the good version of that, quote unquote, where it's like only in the heat of the moment when you're like, all right, we're allowed to say whatever the fuck we want. Are we going to say whatever we want? Outside of that, we're not going to be horrible to each other. So I'm gonna go with you. I think it's only right. It's Carly and Landon in that Exile. Shout out to Jen and Mandy, who I think will ultimately make the bracket one day. Then we got the individual awards, the final two awards to give here, the Rookie of the Season and the MVP. The Rookie of the Season, I think, is pretty easy, probably, but from a nominee standpoint, this season I think I have all of them listed here. We got CJ, Brandon. Well, to be fair to everyone, we have CJ and Caitlin are the two non-fresh meat rookies this season, coming from Brooklyn and Cancun, respectively. And then obviously all the fresh meat are rookies. They're up for this, but I put the nominees of at least deserve mention of a nominee is CJ, Brandon, Carly, Laurel, Pete, Luke, Noor, Mandy, and Teresa, which is way more nominees than we usually have for Rookie of the Season. But again, over half the cast are rookies in this standpoint. Who from that group stands out to you the most? Who do you think deserves the Rookie of the Season award? Might be frozen again.
As a whole, would be by a guy or girl Rookie of the Year, I would say. Can you see me?
Yes, now it's moving fluid. All right.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, from a whole general basis, I would probably say Laurel would be the Rookie of the Year, but if we're doing a girl and guy Rookie of the Year, I would say Laurel and Pete, actually.
Yeah, I think Pete deserves a shout out if we did both sides on the gender here. I think Pete would edge out Noor. As much as I love Noor, Pete just does a lot more between, having the make-out buddies with Jen and performing super well, making the final, being a good hang the whole season long. But it is just a one-person award, and you're spot on. I mean, how can it be anyone other than Laurel? Yeah. She wins everything. She has epic first ever night in a challenge house where she makes out with 3 or 4 different people, ends up passed out on the couch, and no one says a word about it really, because they're just like, well, obviously she's going to kick all of our ass anyways. And then the next day kicks all of their ass in the mud wrestling. So yeah, that Laurel without a doubt, and is likely the only rookie that's going to get mentioned in the biggest award, and that's season MVP. We are still going into this. We have still never had a 2-time MVP in challenge history, which is pretty wild. You're well situated with your sports fandom to understand the MVP here. Of course, it's not just who wins the season every year. That they won the season. They already won that. It is who is the most valuable to this season of the challenge, hands down. If you remove this one person, the season has the biggest drop off. Some seasons there's really great MVPs. There's 3-4 candidates that are really, really good, really deserving. Some seasons there's been a couple seasons where it's kind of hard to even pick. The Gauntlet 3, for instance, Frank ended up getting the MVP on the Gauntlet 3, and it didn't feel like, it rose to the level of some of the other season MVPs have in the past. But that happens in sports. That happens in the challenge house. So I like to break it down into kind of 3 categories: the gone too soon, honorable mentions, and contenders. In the gone too soon, sometimes there's a lot of people in this where they're like, you had a huge impact, but you went home in the 3rd episode. So, 10-episode season, you're not going to really get consideration for this season. It's only one person in that category, and that's Paula. Is there anyone else from the early exits that you think had such a big impact they deserve at least a mention of, like, shout out to them? They were putting forward an MVP season, but then, the equivalent of they got hurt in the NFL or NBA or something in this, they got voted out. So, Paula, I feel like, was putting up MVP stats for 3 episodes, but it's only 3 episodes. She's gone too soon.
Would you throw Wes in that category? Because I agree about Paula. I don't know. I mean, Wes wasn't really necessarily performing that well, but like he had the game by a stranglehold.
Well, Wes is there for 7 of the 10 episodes, which I think is plenty enough to, like, he's on my contenders list. He's a full-fledged nominee in my mind for the MVP of this season. And it's very similar to, sports awards, like being the big NBA guy I am. There's always every year, like, if someone gets hurt, it's like, how many games do you have to play for me to consider, like, whether you played all of them or not? Like in the NFL, it's like, yeah, if you played 14 games and you were the best, is that enough for someone who played every single season or every single game? In Challenge House, it's like, it's kind of that 2/3 to 3/4 mark. Like, if you've made it there, if the whole story is about you but you went home in episode 7 of 10, you're still in contention for me. You still like the season, like Wes this season. We'll mention him in a second, but like he's a contender to me. So the gone too soon portion is really truly like, yeah, you were barely here, but you did a lot in your minute here, which I think Paula is the only one that kind of fits that.
Yeah, I agree with that. But
honorable mentions then, not contenders to win the award, but I think deserving of a shout out just for being value adds this season, and because we maybe didn't mention them as much as they maybe deserved over the course of this podcast. Jen, Teresa, Brandon, and Ryan. I feel like none of them I'm actually considering for MVP, but I feel like they deserve. They all had good
they
seasons.
added something. Yeah.
So shout out to those four. As for contenders, I have 5. You tell me if you'd add anyone to this list, and then we can debate their merits. I've got Laurel, Landon, Wes, Evelyn, and Kenny as the 5 true contenders. Those would be the 5 that would make my final ballot in one order or another. Do you think anyone else deserves mention in this final list of contenders?
No, those are the only 5 I think that could possibly be up for consideration.
Where's your head at then on, are you leaning towards anyone in particular in this group? Is there anyone you think is, you're in a contender, but you're at the bottom, you're 5th on my ballot?
I would, in terms of rankings here, I think would go, Wes would be 5th out of those 5. I think Evelyn would be 4th, then would be Kenny, and then it would come down to Landon and Laurel, but I would actually give the edge to Laurel if we're talking from a whole season basis. I think, when you think of the word valuable, if you remove Laurel from the season, I think you see a vastly different season. Landon could still win, you know what I mean? But let's just say for story purposes, you remove Laurel. We don't get like that same like ebb and flow rivalry and like game shifting going back and forth where Wes's alliance has to like scramble and be like, what do we do? They keep winning all the time. We don't have that. And Landon just goes on and wins an otherwise probably less memorable season. Like it'd be still impressive from a physical standpoint with Landon at the end, but you wouldn't have like the same ebb and flow that you would have by having Laurel here. Like you subtract her and we don't get the same season in my opinion. Whereas if you subtract Landon, we lose a potentially very physically dominant season, but not a whole lot else.
This is interesting because at first I was like, I think you're valuing too much just how they did in the competition, but then your argument's very spot on that while as much as this season is about, Wes and Ev versus Kenny, and my argument against Laurel would have initially been, well, yeah, she kicks ass in all the competitions, but she's kind of not actually a part of the political storyline itself. You're spot on that without her, that political storyline doesn't exist because Kenny doesn't win every single one of the challenges. So I like what you're saying here. Help me work through a couple other things. So my issue, I actually would have probably initially, although I'm changing it on the fly here, would kind of had Laurel in 5th because of what I just said of like, yeah, she kicked apps, but from the storyline perspective, and I maybe weight the show side versus the sports side a little more in my thoughts on the MVP of, the most valuable to the season of the show. And I had Landon in 4th because while he won, he wasn't as big of a factor. And I just kind of by default was like, it's got to be Wes, Evan, Kenny in the top, like the whole season's about them. But now I'm kind of almost flipping that. And on your side, my issue is that I said when we started this segment, there's never been a 2-time winner of the MVP before, right? And there's been a lot of seasons where I thought it was going to happen. And then on Rewatch, I was just like, clearly it's not going to happen. And my issue here is that I am really tempted to say Kenny is the MVP this season. And Kenny has won the MVP before. And I don't know if I give the same disclaimer every season, about him and others. And, by the time someone's listening to this, they will have listened to me talk about the ruins. And, there's a lot to talk about with that season, with, him in particular and everything. I don't want to be the guy that says Kenny is the first 2-time MVP of the challenge because of other, extenuating circumstances, but they get second in the end. He is half of even if Laurel is the dominant half of his team, he's the other half of it. The storyline is Wes and Ev versus Kenny, and Kenny wins, and Kenny pulls ultimately has the more brilliant political moves in the end, even if he's kind of backed into them by Wes and Ev blowing it. So I came into this prepared to talk myself into in the moment that Kenny should win. It should be the first time I ever give someone a second MVP award. Again, because what I also said earlier, when we just talk about this season only, the other season he won was the Inferno 3, which I know people listening unfortunately can't rewatch that season. It's not available. Not a good season overall, and not a very enjoyable season. And it's the first of string of seasons where there's kind of a lot of gross, bad behavior basically going on. And weirdly enough, that is what the other season where it's like Kenny seems to be the one everyone likes and isn't being as mean to everyone as he turns out to be in other instances. And this season is kind of the same, as we said earlier, like everyone likes him. He's actually loyal to everyone this season. So I was torn between Wes, Ev, and him having to be at the top, but I love Landon so much, and I like your argument for Laurel so much that if we do go by like, who do we remove, what actually happens? Obviously, if you remove Wes or Kenny, we don't have that storyline. But I like what you had said about if we remove Laurel, we don't have that storyline either. So I'm kind of finding myself torn. I'm at a little crossroads here.
If Laurel isn't on Kenny's team, Kenny does not see the light of day of a final on that season.
Yeah, we mentioned before, if Darrell picks Laurel, even if then you give Kenny, Cara, Maria,
Kenny's out the first episode.
Yeah,
Kenny's out the first episode too. If he has Teresa. Darrell and Laurel probably win that daily, and then Wes does the same thing that he did with Kenny in saying like, hey, let's get this guy out of here. And he cuts a deal with Darrell, and then they send Kenny in. That first episode is probably what happens.
Yeah. And I bet it actually would have went as far as it might have ultimately made for a kind of more boring season afterward. But if Darrell picks Laurel, they do win the first challenge, and Wes tries to make that deal. But I would see Darrell being like, nope, no, Wes. How this is going to go is you and Kenny are both going in there because no one in the house wants to deal with y'all's bullshit this whole season. And I feel like it would have been Kenny versus Wes for one episode, and one of them would have won. Well, I also, when I think of these awards, as much as I shouldn't do it because I am doing these all retroactively, it's different than, in the world of sports or whatever, where you're doing it in the moment. I do like to think historical context, and I'm not sure there's going to be another season where Laurel wins the MVP, but she feels like someone who deserves her impact on the show, deserves to be an MVP winner. So I think we've gotten there. I think I'm going to come all the way around, and I think I'm going to be with you, and I think we're going to give the MVP of the season to Laurel. I think I feel okay about it.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, Laurel, welcome to the club. And we continue to not have a two-time winner in the history of this show, which I haven't actually, but again, time of recording, pull you behind the scenes, haven't recorded the Duel 2 podcast. Landon may be up for opportunity there. So we could be possibly missing on multiple people here who could have been a two-time MVP. But Laurel it is. Laurel gets MVP in her first season ever. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in the future, maybe a fresh or free agents, possibly. Maybe a Rivals one, possibly. We'll see if she's going to make some more ballots in the future. But she's the MVP for now, which brings us to the final thing we've got to do before we get out of here. Mike, you've been so gracious with your time. We've got to give the season a final grade. Now, we're going to do this together, but then there will be an addendum because I don't want to make you sit through my long deliberation. It's usually 15 to 20 minutes of me recapping and giving my official letter grade that I've done for all the seasons so far. So I'll do that after the fact, but together here, what letter grade would you give this season, and where does it rank all time for you? We know earlier you said it's one of your favorite seasons of all time, but if we try to be as objective as we could possibly be, what letter grade do you give this season, and where do you think it falls on the all-time list?
I would probably give it a solid B+. I think it's a really solid season. I think We saw a lot of funny moments. We saw the cast having fun despite a different location, which was kind of new at the time. I think up to that point, we hadn't really seen a ton of cold weather. I think the Duel 2 was a little bit cold, right? If I remember correctly.
Mhm.
But aside from that, that was pretty taboo at the time, and they made it work. We saw it was kind of a relatively fresh cast without like Johnny and Evan, just the Johannas of the world. So I like the cast setup. Everybody kind of pulled their weight, I thought, in that regard. I think the only thing, and it could have been good because, maybe the daily dominance is what kind of led to a lot of the storylines within the gameplay. But I think, it was a relatively one-sided daily showing throughout the season. That's maybe the only like thing where it wasn't a ton of suspense from like a daily challenge standpoint. That's the one thing that might hurt it, but it has a great ending that makes up for it. And you had like the feel good story at the end that was unlikely. So I think just due to that is enough to make it a solid B plus.
And where if you're slightly, I always talk about myself being a pretty tough grader. It sounds like you've got a pretty strict scale, or one of those teachers who maybe is hard pressed to give out A's, which is how I think it should be and how I mostly am. Where then would you maybe put it all time for you? Because I'm with you. It's very good, really solid. There's no weak parts, and the only weak part is, as you said, if you want to say it's not that competitive, but because the dailies aren't that competitive, it makes the political part of the game extremely competitive. And that's, becomes the storyline and is so compelling. So that kind of balances out the nature of like, it's working for the show that one team is dominating. So even that's not really a weakness to me. So it's good across the board. A lot of great involved. As a big Landon fan, obviously it's great to like have this be, as much as I wanted more Landon in my life, knowing that this was the final season and having the final moment be him on the mountaintop, him and Carly, like so thrilled, TJ giving them their props and everything. All of that is great. Where would you put it kind of in an all-time, not, you don't got to go your 1 through 37 rank right here, but is this like kind of in top tier with the best seasons ever? Is it a little below whatever group you might have is like best of all time? Where does it fall for you?
I would put it in like an A tier for me, at least personally. My S tier, X's 2 is obviously up there. Rivals 2 is up there. So I would probably put this in kind of like my A tier, I would say.
So just below the greatest
Just
of all
below
time?
the cream of the crop, but like,
Yeah.
Above more than half of the rest of the seasons.
For sure. I struggle with a little. There's, again, if you say like best of all time, you're like, you got to qualify for that for me. Like, what are you actually asking about? Because whoever's asking that might be thinking a completely different thing. And it's a subjective word of like, what do you think the best is? I think I said earlier, I thought this was the best casting job that they had ever done, from a like manufacturing in the right way of storylines and everything, which is why this season, it's one of my all-time favorites. I'm kind of right with you. If we're talking the best season of all time, the greatest seasons of all time, I've got 2 to 4 that are in like the top tier on their own line. And this is certainly in the next group, and maybe even at the top of the next group. But I do think, from just a like you mentioned at the beginning, this would be one of the great seasons if someone's never watched the challenge, of like, you should watch this season. It's just a really satisfying, well done season where, again, it doesn't have any of those weaknesses. It's compelling all the way through. They're having fun. There's romantic elements, there's fighting elements, but none of them, it's like, there's none of the ugly stuff that the seasons prior and some seasons after it had. There's nothing where you'd be like, the challenge, like warts. I always talk about like some of the seasons have warts on them that are like the challenge. It's part of your history. You're not proud that it's part of your history. This season doesn't have any of that. It's just like compelling characters, an interesting story. Even though the story's sucked up by these couple of people, everyone's involved in it. Everyone gets their little moments. It's an interesting feel-good winner at the end. All across the board, it's just really well done and really well produced. So in that like kind of framing, I think it's one of the best of all time, of just like, it's really well done. There's no, like, they nailed it on this one. They like really knew what they were doing, and they could put out a great product, and they like confidently could be like, we're going to give you a great product and deliver on it. But it does fall just in maybe that tier 2 for me, the top of tier 2, but I'm not quite, whenever I do my greatest seasons of all time, it's probably an honorable mention, but it's not quite going to make, maybe the final 5 ballot, or maybe it does. I haven't went back through all the seasons yet. Eventually, once I've graded all of them on the same scale, we'll see where it ends up. But with that, Mike, I got to say thanks once again for not only joining me, but giving me so much of your time on a busy NFL Sunday as it is now. For all of those listening, can you let them know where best to follow you, where to get all of your great content, maybe a couple recent interviews that'd be best if someone hadn't listened to any of your interviews before, a good introduction for them, the way the Fresh Meat 2 might be a good intro season for them, a good intro interview for them if they're hopping in for the first time. Where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you guys could follow me on Instagram or just social media in general. Mike Lewis Podcast, one word, on Instagram and Twitter. And then obviously I'm across all platforms such as Spotify and Apple. The bulk of my work I like to put on my YouTube channel, which is Mike Lewis Podcast, all separate word. And I've recently interviewed Yes and Latarian from All Stars. Those are good places to start. But if you make all the way down to my navigation of my channel and my podcast feed, you'll notice that I've got the Landons, the Cara Marias of the world. So those are good places to start if you want to hear more about Fresh Meat 2, which is what we talked about in this. I talk a lot about that with them. So yeah, thank you again for having me. I had a ton of fun.
Yeah, and I will, of course, link all of that in the show notes. So anyone listening could just go right there to click and find through, and make sure to hit the follow, subscribe so you don't miss anything from Mike in the future. And I will say, I have listened to a majority of your interviews before. I have listened to the Landon one before, but it's the one I'm going to actually go back and listen to again now because I was forgetting so much of it. I believe it was your 100th episode. You had Cara and Paulie at the same time on. Am I remembering that correct?
Yeah.
Or like some big round number episode for you. I remember.
Landon was my 50th.
Okay. Was Cara and Paulie like your 100th?
I think Hasella was my 100th. Okay. I think Cara and Paulie was like 125, I think.
Okay, yeah. I remember liking that dual interview with them, and I just thought it was called it, it was a big round number. So you did what I've done and just been like, it's a big round number. I might as well say it too while doing this thing that I would have done anyways, but love those. And then my favorite, I think ever, which might be recency bias, even though it wasn't a recent interview, but I listened to it recently, was Brad, who I think you've done multiple with Brad. Is that possible?
I think one.
Just one. Brad. Yeah. I listened to, the one, it makes it easier to find, but loved your interview with Brad. I listened to it way back when it first came out because it was a little earlier on in your podcast time. It's definitely a 2021, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I listened to it recently. I met Brad at one of the Challenge Mania events, and the couple days before it, I was like trying to get some questions and things in my head, and so I re-listened to your interview with Brad to like get me prepared for like, does he mention anything here I'd want to like have him expound on or whatever? And that one's absolutely great. So if I could say, if anyone's trying to get a nice dive into what the Mike Lewis podcast experience is about, I thought that interview was really, really well done and really, really interesting, and is one now I've listened to multiple times and enjoyed it both times. So I'll link everything below. Mike, thanks for being here, and everyone listening, thank you for being here. We'll be back with the my full season grade here in a second, and then back with Cutthroat here in a week. So thanks for being here, and thank you to you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we just broke it all down with Mike. You just heard more or less my summary for where I'm putting this season all time. But as we've done with every season thus far, I've got to give it its official grade. I've got to break it down the same way we've done every other season. So we said goodbye to Mike. We've got to give our official season grade, and then we will get out of here as well. So as always, female cast, male cast, show grade, sport grade, that helps us build an overall grade for the show, to put it in the Pantheon, to put it in the Hall of Fame, to put it in the rankings for all time where it stands with all of the other challenge seasons. So let's do that now. As always, we start with the female cast, and we will come back to this later, but we start the same as we've done with all the casting grades with heavy hitters, solid players, and duds, which we'll touch on later. Maybe this is the first time where I'm realizing I didn't do this part exactly right. But for the time being, heavy hitters on the female side. We've got Evelyn, Sarah, Paula, Laurel, Teresa, and Cara Maria. Yes, 3 of those are rookies on this season, and that makes it all the more interesting. It's incredible on a rewatch to go back and be like, oh my God, Cara Maria is here and is out first. That's insane that she went on to be Cara Maria after the 1 episode we see here. But either way you slice it, those are the heavy hitters. Solid contributors, Jillian, Jen, Carly, Mandy, and duds, Caitlin, Sydney, Sandy. Sydney and Sandy, they gave us a moment or two this season. They maybe had potential, but we don't see them again, and we don't get much from them. And Caitlin just never totally worked for me on this show either. So overall, yeah, that all up, it's a B+ on the female side. We've got 6 out of 13 heavy hitters and 4 solid contributors, and the mix works really well for the show. So that's a B+ on the men's side. Touch lower, we got a B for the male cast grade. Heavy hitters: Landon, Kenny, West, Darrell. Solid contributors: Ryan, CJ, Danny, Pete, Noor, Luke, and Brandon. And then the only duds I would say of this group are Jeff and Vinny. Certainly a dud on Vinny. Jeff, it was a one-time thing, and, he was getting yelled at by Paula to keep up with the former tuba player. So Jeff falls in the dud category as well. And overall, a little bit more, just a lot of solid contributors, only the big 4 heavy hitters, which again, by design, that was to the benefit of the show. I'll touch a little on that again here at the end, but the male cast gets a B, as does the sport grade. Everything in this season was just good, really, really solid. It was the definition of a B. It was certifiably good. You could not say it was anywhere near average or bad or anything like that, but you also weren't going to point to almost any moments that were great or that would be, pushing towards an A category. This was just definitively a B across the board. There were a couple high highs with those nighttime exiles, with specifically the Landon and Carly one that we gave the Exile of the Year award to. But overall, this is just a B all the way through. But do want to give another shout out. We mentioned it a time or two, I believe, in the podcast, but this was also just a really well-produced season from the competitive standpoint. 0 issues. Everything was clear, really well done. Final challenge, or really just like everything seemed to make sense to everyone involved and to us at home. All of that good stuff, well-produced. A solid B all around. And then the show grade. That's where this season gets its love, gets all of its accolades. The show part, that's a full-blown A. That is, again, the perfect casting to create the compelling storylines. So that worked incredibly. And the fact that everyone was a part of that same overarching storyline, everything we talked about for hours on end with Mike, all rolled into this. A very, very good score on the show side. We had romance everywhere. We had parties everywhere. They were all having a great time, and it matters when the cast is having a good time. It creates good TV. The roller coaster political swing of West to Kenny, the underdog story of Landon and Carly winning, Jen and Mandy's fight, Brandon's DQ, the condiment fight, all those moments we talked about in that award and throughout the podcast. Just in general, every single episode of the season is really, really good. This has the highest average rating. I grade every single episode. I don't just grade every single season. I grade every single episode as I watch these seasons. This season is the first one ever to not have a single episode dip below a B-. Every episode, all 10 are in the B or A range. This starts out hot with the first 3 episodes of this season are flawless, damn near perfect. It slightly tapers off, but only slightly. It tapers off to just really, really solid to good to verge of great the rest of the season, but it is as consistently good to great of a season as we've had up until this point, which leads me to the overall ranking then, which is going to be an A-. We've got to put it in that top category. It's in the A rankings. It sneaks its way in. This is like the 91 on your test. You just barely by 1% got into that A range. And this season, to me, as Mike and I kind of said more or less, it's not a contender for the best season of all time, but it is invited to the banquet when we hand out that award. It's in the room. It's not, it's not one of the whatever number it'll be. Maybe it'll be 3, maybe it'll be 5, whatever the final number is of like, these are the ones really in contention for best season of all time. Fresh Meat 2 will be in that room. We'll be hanging out with those folks, but it won't actually be up for the award or for that specific award. That's exactly how I feel about it, which makes an A- feel perfect. It's in the top tier. It's in the upper echelon, but it knows when it goes into that room that it is, it knows where it falls on the totem pole of that particular room, and which would be at the bottom, because Duel 1 remains number 1 of all the shows we have graded thus far. I would take Inferno 1 and Inferno 2, which both got A- as well. I would put them above Fresh Meat 2 as well as Fresh Meat 1, which also got an A-. And right now, if you asked me right now which way I would lean, Fresh Meat 1 or 2, if I had to break that tie, put one above the other, I'd honestly maybe even lean Fresh Meat 1. And part of that might just be me in the moment trying to not be biased about the season I just watched and my personal reasons for thinking this season is so fun for me as a fan and everything I like about the show, and trying to be as objective as possible. So I don't know, but that's where it's at. Fresh Meat 1 and 2 are pretty much dead even, just on the bottom of the A level of the greatness level, but below the other couple of seasons who have got their way into that category, into that exclusive club, as we've done now 17 seasons. Again, this one ended up being a little bit out of order when you are listening to it. And the casting thing that I was referencing earlier is where I might be seeing some flaws in my grading system now. We'll end on this. The casting grades were, I've maybe gone against my own argument in this very podcast, where I've said this is the perfect casting job. They did it so well, and that the goal of casting isn't the biggest names, but is to get the right mix of people to create the opportunity for compelling storylines, or the most opportunity for the most compelling storylines. And then I realized that my grading system for the cast is more or less just the bigger the names, the better. So I have argued against myself on this very podcast, and guess what? This is not the first time. I'm sure you're like, yeah, you do that like every other week, every other episode. But, I'm doing it in a big way here. So I maybe will have to rethink how I'm doing the casting grades, but it is why this is not an average of, male cast, female cast, sport grade, show grade. The average of those 4 equals your overall grade. It is not. In this instance, I weight that A in the show grade category way, way higher than I do the other 3, the B+, the B, and the B. That's how I come to an A-, and that's how I kind of get myself out of the pickle that I put myself in by saying that, my casting grades are based off this, but in actuality, this season is the definition of why casting isn't just the biggest names possible. So it's an A-. It's a wonderful season. It might be it's really high on my favorite seasons of all time. Again, subjective list, objective list. Objectively, this is in the room, but not in the conversation for the greatest season of all time. But subjectively, my personal taste and what I'm looking for and loving from this show, this one is in the conversation for truly my favorite season of all time. If I had to rewatch one, I only got one of them that I was ever allowed to rewatch, or that I got to show a friend who's never seen the show, anything like that. This one's in the conversation to be chosen. It's why I was so excited for this season, for this doing this Rewatch podcast, and why I've had so much fun doing it here at the end solo most of the time with my good friend Mike. I hope you have had a great time watching or listening, however you were consuming. We appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for being here. Hit that follow, subscribe button so you don't miss any future content. And remember, just because we went out of order doesn't mean that we're skipping Duel 2 or Ruins. Both very interesting, very worthwhile seasons to talk about for their own reasons, but we will be doing those. We will be back next week on Monday with Duel 2, the following Monday with the Ruins. Maybe solo on those again, and then we'll possibly have some co-hosts coming up again once we hit season 20. Cutthroat Mike might be back for that one or another. We might have a couple others popping in. Who knows who's going to pop on and talk to us about. We've got, once we hit Cutthroat, we're really going there for a minute. Cutthroat, Rivals, X's, Free Agents, Rivals, and X's too. Yes, I skipped Battle of the Seasons, but that's just how it goes. We're about to hit the peak challenge territory here very, very soon. But for now, that is all for today. Thank you for being here. As always, if you have any comments about this pod or any of the pods, you just want to chop it up about the challenge, hit me up on Instagram at Challenge Historian. Happy to talk challenge any day of the week. Remember, season 38 preview comes out this Wednesday. Challenge documentary recap on Friday. Recapping Survivor if you're a Survivor fan as well. Those are on Most Likely to. Thank you for being here. I'll talk to you again soon. Peace.